Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, this little channel only exists because people like you decide quietly it's worth a small gesture. If you subscribe, it simply starts finding its way back to you. No searching required the next time you can't sleep. A like helps too. It costs nothing and tells me these stories are worth making more of. While you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a farmhouse outside Des Moines, everything gone quiet for the night, somewhere in Ohio, the day finally winding down, a flat in Toronto with the rain against the window. Leave a comment and tell me. I always read every single one. All right, love, dim the lights. Let your body go heavy. Comfortable? Good. Let's go. It is a little past 6 in the morning, late autumn, 1893, and the sun has not yet cleared the rooftops of Fifth Avenue. Inside a house built to look 400 years older than it actually is, a maid is on her knees in the breakfast room with a soft cloth, polishing the legs of a table that will seat 14 people who will never once comment on how clean it is. That is the detail I want to start with actually, not the marble, not the gold leaf, not the sweeping staircase you are probably already picturing. Just that. A woman on her knees at 6 in the morning, polishing something that exists purely to be looked at without being noticed. Keep that image somewhere in the back of your mind tonight. We are going to come back to it. The house belongs to Charles and Eleanor Whitfield, and I want to be clear about who they are from the very start because their story is worth knowing properly rather than piecing together. Charles is 51 years old this year. He made his fortune, or rather he multiplied a fortune that was already respectable into something enormous, through steel and through the rail lines that carried it, and he did this in roughly 20 years, which by the standards of old New York families is embarrassingly fast. Eleanor is 44. She was born into money that was, by the measure of the era, one generation more polished than her husband's, which matters more than you would think, and we will get to why. They have 2 children still living at home, a son, Henry, who is 19, and has just come back from his second year at Yale for a stretch of weeks before returning. A daughter, Marion, who is 17, and is, this very season, being introduced to society in the particular ritualized way that phrase actually meant in 1893, which we will also get to. Eleanor is already awake. She has been awake, in fact, since a little before 6, lying still in the deep quiet of a bedroom with walls upholstered in pale blue silk that a French decorator selected specifically because it was, in his words, the colour of a morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it will be. She's not anxious exactly. She's doing something closer to what a conductor does before a performance, running the shape of the day through her mind before her feet even touch the floor. There is a luncheon today for 11 women whose good opinion matters more than she would ever say aloud. There is a fitting at 3. There is a note that needs answering before 10 o'clock, because to answer it later would itself communicate something, and in Eleanor's world, timing is a language all its own, and there is, underneath all of it, this simple truth, that tonight the house hosts a dinner for 30, the first large one of the autumn season, and a great deal rides on it going well. Here is a fact that tends to surprise people, and it is a good place to begin, because it tells you something true about the scale we're dealing with tonight. The house itself, this particular house, cost more to build than the entire annual budget of some American cities in this period. Not a metaphor, an actual comparison that contemporary newspapers love to make, usually with a mixture of awe and faint disapproval. The marble alone was quarried in a specific region of Italy and shipped across an ocean in blocks so heavy that special reinforced docks had to be built just to unload them. The plasterwork on the ceiling of the main hall was done by craftsmen brought over from France for the sole purpose of that ceiling, and when they finished, most of them simply went home. Their entire American experience was one room. I find that detail strange every time I think about it. A man crosses an ocean, spends the better part of a year lying on his back on scaffolding, shaping acanthus leaves out of wet plaster, and then leaves, having seen nothing of the country but the inside of one ceiling. The scale of these houses, and there were perhaps 24 of them at this level of extravagance scattered along a few blocks of Manhattan, is genuinely difficult to picture correctly if you have not stood inside one. We tend to imagine a large ornate home, something like an especially grand hotel. That is not quite it. These were built with the explicit architectural language of European palaces, borrowed wholesale and without much embarrassment. Grand staircases wide enough for several people to descend abreast without touching, because a woman's evening dress in this era required room, real room, simply to exist in motion. Ballrooms that stood empty 360 days a year, heated and dusted and maintained by full-time staff for the sake of perhaps 5 evenings of actual use. There is something almost theatrical about it when you sit with it long enough. An entire wing of a house, essentially a stage set, waiting. Eleanor rings for her maid at 6:15, and this is worth pausing on, because I think people picture wealthy women of this era waking whenever they liked and floating gently into their day. That is not quite the truth of it. The truth is closer to a woman running something like a small, extremely demanding company, except that the company is her household, her family's position, and her own reputation, all 3 at once, and none of it is called work by anyone, least of all by her. We will spend tonight pulling that back into the light a little, gently, the way you might turn a photograph toward better light just to see it properly. Charles, meanwhile, is already dressed and down in his study, which is 1 floor below Eleanor's bedroom, and, in every meaningful sense, a different country. His day runs on different clocks entirely. There is a telephone in the study now, a recent addition, and he still finds himself slightly amazed by it, though he would never say so. He has a stack of telegrams waiting from the overnight wire, most of them concerning rail freight rates and the price of steel rail per ton, a number he can recite for the last 6 months without looking at a single figure written down. This is the part of the story that people find genuinely interesting once they hear it properly, so let us slow down here for a moment. Charles did not inherit this house, or this scale of wealth. His father ran a moderately successful iron foundry in Pennsylvania, comfortable, respectable, entirely unremarkable by the standards of New York money. Charles took what his father built, and over roughly 2 decades, turned it into something enormous by doing something that sounds almost too simple to be the foundation of a fortune. He understood, earlier than most of his competitors, that the railroads expanding westward across the continent would need steel rail in quantities nobody else was prepared to supply, and he built the capacity to supply it before the demand fully arrived. He was, in the language of the period, a man who bet correctly on the future, and then bet correctly again, and then again, until the bets compounded into something that newspapers had started calling a fortune with a capital letter, as though it deserved its own proper noun. Here is the detail that I think is the most quietly fascinating part of this whole story. Old New York, the families who had been wealthy for 3 or 4 generations, the ones whose money came from shipping or land or banking established before the Revolution, did not initially want anything to do with people like Charles. There was an actual social hierarchy, an unwritten but ferociously enforced one, that separated what people called old money from new money. And new money, however enormous, however many millions larger than the old fortunes it might be, started at the bottom of the ladder and had to climb. Eleanor's family, by contrast, belonged to that older tier, 1 generation more established, which is precisely why her marriage to Charles was, in its era, considered a small scandal dressed up as a triumph. She brought the name, he brought the money. A New York society, which pretended to care only about breeding, in practice cared enormously about both, in a ratio that shifted depending entirely on how much money was involved. There was, and this really is true, an actual number that mattered. Society gossip of the era spoke of a list, informally called the 400, supposedly representing the exact number of people who could comfortably fit in the ballroom of the single most socially powerful hostess in New York, and therefore the exact number of people who mattered. Whether the number was ever taken quite that literally is a matter some historians still debate, but the idea of it, the notion that social significance in America's wealthiest city could be reduced to a finite guest list, tells you almost everything you need to know about the anxieties running underneath all this marble and gold leaf. Eleanor thinks about that list more than she would ever admit. Not because she doubts her place on it, because she has watched families lose their place on it. Quietly, over the course of a single bad season, and she has learned that the ground under her feet, for all its solidity, is not actually as fixed as it looks. Henry comes down to breakfast at 7:30, which is early for him, and which Eleanor notices immediately, the way a mother notices these small variations without appearing to notice anything at all. He is 19, tall, still slightly unused to his own height the way young men often are at that age, dressed all ready for the day in a manner that took him considerably longer than he would ever admit to another young man his age. He kisses his mother's cheek, greets his father with a nod that is trying very hard to look like the nod of an equal and mostly succeeding, and sits down to a breakfast that would, on any ordinary Tuesday in most American households of this era, be considered a small feast in itself. Eggs prepared 3 different ways because nobody could say in advance which way anyone would prefer. Kidneys, which Charles favours and Eleanor has never once managed to enjoy. Toast kept warm under silver domes. Coffee and also tea because the household keeps both ready at all times every single morning on the chance that a guest arrives unannounced, which happens perhaps 4 times a year and is prepared for every single day regardless. The food itself is worth a moment, because there is a detail here that surprises people every time I mention it. Much of what appears on this breakfast table did not come from a shop. The Whitfields, like most families of this exact tier, maintained a working farm well outside the city, a place most guests never saw and few even knew existed, whose entire purpose was to supply this one household with eggs, milk, butter, and produce that could be trusted absolutely, because in an era before reliable food safety regulation, trust was not a small thing. A farm staffed year-round, existing for the sole purpose of guaranteeing that one family's breakfast eggs were fresh and safe. I think about the economics of that sometimes. A private farm as a household appliance. Marion is the last to appear at closer to 8, and her morning has its own particular texture that is worth understanding before we move any further into the day, because this is her season, in the very specific sense that phrase carried in 1893. She turned 17 in the spring, and this autumn marks her formal introduction to society, a process that sounds quaint from a distance and turns out, up close, to be closer to a military campaign than a party. There will be a debut ball in January, months from now, but the groundwork for it, the calls that must be made and received correctly, the invitations that must start flowing in the right direction, the careful, almost architectural construction of her social visibility has already begun. And it began, in truth, months before this particular morning. A debut, if you have never had reason to think about the mechanics of one, was not simply a party thrown in a young woman's honour. It was closer to a formal announcement of market readiness, though nobody would ever have phrased it in such blunt terms at the time. From this January forward, Marion will be eligible, visible, and, in the calculating language that ran underneath every polite conversation of the era, available. The families with sons of appropriate standing will take note. The families with daughters of similar age will assess her as a potential rival or a potential friend, sometimes both at once, sometimes shifting between the two within a single season. Marion understands this, in the way that a clever 17-year-old understands the rules of a game she has been watching her entire life without ever being allowed to play. She's nervous about it in a way she tries very hard not to show, and mostly succeeds, except at breakfast, where she pushes her eggs around her plate a little more than she eats them, and her mother notices and says nothing, because there will be time to talk about it later privately, the way mothers and daughters in this house actually talk, which is different from the way this family talks to everyone else. Let us shift for a moment, because there is a physical object I want to tell you about, one that sits on the sideboard in this very breakfast room, and which carries a small story worth knowing. It is a silver tea service, quite ornate, English-made, and it was a wedding gift to Eleanor's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women in her family before arriving here. It is, by any reasonable measure, worth a great deal of money. But that is not really why it matters in this house. It matters because it is one of the only objects in this entire enormous building that Eleanor did not select, did not commission, did not have shipped from Europe with a decorator's careful eye toward matching wallpaper and cornice work. It simply arrived, generations old, carrying its own history that predates this house entirely, predates this marriage entirely, predates the steel and the rail lines and all of it. Eleanor insists it be used every single morning rather than displayed behind glass, which the household's decorator found slightly baffling when he first arranged the room. She has never fully explained why, not even to Charles. I think, honestly, that some objects are less about what they are worth and more about what they remember, and this is one of those, sitting quietly among things that cost far more and mean far less. Outside, the city is properly awake now. Fifth Avenue at this hour carries a specific sound that people who lived through this period wrote about often, and it is worth describing because it is genuinely gone now, vanished so completely that we have to reconstruct it from letters and diaries. The sound of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone, a rhythmic clatter that never fully stopped during daylight hours, layered underneath the cries of street vendors a few blocks over where the avenue gives way to more ordinary commerce, and somewhere further off, the newer sound, still strange to most ears in 1893, of an electric streetcar humming along its rails. The Whitfield house itself has been fitted with electric lighting only in the past 2 years, replacing gas fixtures throughout most of the main rooms, and this was, at the time, still enough of a novelty that guests occasionally commented on it, the way you might comment on any new piece of technology that still feels slightly like magic. Eleanor remembers the first evening the lights came on properly throughout the ground floor, remembers standing in the main hall, watching the light hold perfectly steady, without flicker, without the faint gas smell she had known her whole life, and feeling something she can only describe as a small, private wonder, even though she would never have said so out loud, at the dinner party held that same week, specifically to show the lighting off to their circle. There is a household rule, unspoken but absolute, that no member of the family discusses money directly, ever, under any circumstances, not at breakfast, not at dinner, not even privately between husband and wife in the quiet of their own rooms. This might strike you as strange, given how much of this family's identity, position, and daily texture is built directly on money, but that is precisely the point. In this world, the surest sign that you are not truly wealthy, not truly established, was talking about wealth as though it were interesting or new. The old families never mentioned money because they had always had it, and needing to mention it would suggest otherwise. New money families, families like the Whitfields technically still were, only one generation removed from an iron foundry in Pennsylvania, understood this rule with a kind of desperate precision, because getting it wrong, even once, in front of the wrong person, could set back years of careful social work. Eleanor has trained herself so thoroughly in this particular silence that she sometimes forgets, genuinely forgets, for whole stretches of a day, the actual scale of what surrounds her. It becomes, after enough years, simply the water she swims in, invisible the way water is invisible to a fish. At 8:30, the first correspondence of the day arrives on a silver tray, and Eleanor moves to her writing desk in the small morning room just off the main hall, a room decorated specifically for this purpose and used for almost nothing else. This is worth understanding properly because it tells you something true about the shape of her actual work, if we can call it that, though nobody in her world ever would. There are, this particular morning, 11 letters requiring a response before noon, acceptances and regrets for various invitations, each of which must be phrased with an exactness that a modern reader would find almost absurd, because the smallest variation in wording, a regret expressed slightly too warmly or slightly too coolly, could be read by its recipient as a message all its own. There is a note to the dressmaker confirming the afternoon fitting. There is a longer letter to a cousin in Boston that Eleanor has been meaning to write for 11 days and feels genuinely guilty about, guilt being one of the few emotions in her day that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with simply missing someone. And there is one letter that she writes last, and folds smaller than the others, and seals with rather more care than the occasion would seem to require. And this is a letter to her sister, and we are going to come back to that letter later tonight because it carries a piece of Eleanor's life that almost nobody in this house, and nobody at all in her social circle, knows anything about at all. By 10 o'clock the morning calls have begun, and I want to explain what these actually were, because the phrase sounds pleasant and social and slightly quaint, and the reality was considerably stranger and more rigid than that. A morning call, despite the name, never actually happened in the morning. It happened in the early afternoon, always, and the rules governing it were extensive enough that entire chapters of etiquette manuals were devoted to nothing else. You called between certain narrow hours. You stayed no longer than 15 or 20 minutes, timed essentially, though nobody carried a watch openly for this purpose. Everyone simply knew. You left a calling card, a small printed card bearing your name and the manner in which you left it. Which corner you turned down, if any, carried its own coded meaning that the household receiving it was expected to read correctly. A card left in person meant one thing. A card sent by servant meant something slightly less. The whole system functioned as a kind of silent, continuous scorekeeping, and everyone participated in it with total seriousness, because the alternative, opting out, was itself a message, and never a good one. Eleanor receives 3 calls this particular late morning, and declines to be at home for a 4th, which is its own small piece of information transmitted to a woman she has decided, this season, to keep at a slight distance, for reasons that have everything to do with a rumour that travelled through several drawing rooms last spring, and that Eleanor has not entirely forgiven, though she would describe her feelings, if pressed, as nothing more than mild reserve. This is where I want to talk about something people find genuinely delicious once they hear the details, which is the actual mechanics of rivalry and gossip among families at this level of wealth, because it was not petty in the small domestic sense the word usually implies. It was closer to diplomacy between small nations, conducted with the same seriousness, the same long memory, the same capacity for both alliance and quiet retaliation. Here is a case that was, at the time, one of the more talked about pieces of society news, and it illustrates the stakes involved rather well. A decade earlier, one of the city's most established old families had for several years running refused to acknowledge a newly wealthy family at all, socially speaking, on the grounds that their money, however enormous, was simply too recent to matter. The new family responded, not with anger exactly, but with strategy. They built a house even larger and more extravagant than anything the old families possessed, filled it with art and furnishings that made the older houses look, by comparison, almost modest, and threw a costume ball so lavish and so widely reported in the newspapers that the old guard found themselves, within a single season, having to choose between continuing to ignore this family and looking, by contrast, faintly irrelevant. Enough of them chose acknowledgement that the new family's position was, within a few years, entirely secure. This is the kind of contest Eleanor grew up watching, and it is the kind of contest she now, at 44, plays rather skillfully herself, though always with a great deal more subtlety than a single costume ball. The lunch itself, hosted this same day for 11 women, deserves its own attention, because it is easy to imagine something like a modern ladies' lunch and miss entirely how much labour and calculation sat underneath it. The guest list took Eleanor the better part of 2 weeks to finalise, and every name on it was chosen with a specific purpose. 2 women whose husbands sit on business boards alongside Charles, whose goodwill matters for reasons that have nothing to do with lunch at all. 1 woman whose daughter is roughly Marian's age, and whose friendship, or at least whose daughter's friendship, Eleanor would like Marian to cultivate ahead of the debut season. 1 older woman, quite formidable, whose good opinion functions almost as a kind of social currency in itself, capable of lending weight to anyone she chooses to be seen approving of. The seating chart alone, who sits beside whom, who sits across from whom, who is placed near the head of the table, and who is placed comfortably but unmistakably further down, took Eleanor nearly an hour to finalise the night before, and she rewrote it twice. The food served at this lunch, prepared by a French chef the household employs full-time, a man named Delacroix, who trained in Paris, and whose salary alone would astonish most of the guests he cooks for if they ever thought to ask, which they never do, moved through 6 courses, each paired with its own wine, each course small enough that a woman could eat all 6 without feeling the meal as heavy, because appearing to eat with real appetite was, for reasons wrapped up in an era's particular anxieties about femininity and restraint, considered faintly unrefined. The conversation moved, as it always did at these lunches, through several layers simultaneously. On the surface, pleasant talk of the opera season just beginning, of a new novel several of the women claimed to have read, of a recent charitable committee one of them chairs. Underneath that surface, a constant, careful transmission of actual information: who has been seen where, whose daughter's prospects are improving or fading, whose husband's business is rumoured to be under strain. A rumour that, once it takes hold in rooms like this one, can do real damage regardless of whether it happens to be true. There is a particular skill involved in navigating a table like this one, and Eleanor possesses it in genuine abundance, though she would never describe it as a skill, only as manners. It involves listening far more than speaking, remembering everything said to you with total precision while appearing to remember nothing in particular, and steering conversation gently away from any topic that might embarrass a guest, without that guest ever quite noticing the redirection occurred. I find myself genuinely admiring this, the more I study it. It is a form of intelligence that history has mostly declined to call intelligence, because it operated in drawing rooms rather than boardrooms, and because the women who possessed it were, by the conventions of their era, not supposed to be doing anything at all except existing decoratively. The decorative version is the one that survived in portraits and in popular memory. The actual skill underneath it largely did not. The lunch ends a little after 2, and by 3 Eleanor is at her dressmaker, a woman named Madame Rousseau, whose small, elegant shop sits just off the avenue, and whose client list includes most of the women who were, an hour earlier, sitting at Eleanor's table. This is one of the strange intimacies of this world, that the same small circle of women who compete so carefully with one another in drawing rooms also share dressmakers, share the same handful of imported fabrics, occasionally even share the same design ideas, adapted just enough to avoid the genuine social catastrophe of 2 women appearing at the same event in nearly identical gowns. Madame Rousseau keeps a private notebook, which Eleanor has never seen but strongly suspects exists, cataloguing exactly which client has claimed which silhouette for the season, precisely so that catastrophe can be avoided before it happens. The gown being fitted this afternoon is for tonight's dinner, and I want to describe the actual construction of it for a moment, because the numbers involved genuinely surprise people. A formal evening gown at this level of society, in this particular year, could easily require between 15 and 20 yards of silk, in addition to the boning, the underlayers, the trim, and the labour of several skilled seamstresses working across multiple days. The weight of the finished garment, fully assembled, often exceeded 10 pounds, sometimes considerably more if beading or elaborate trim was involved, and Eleanor has worn dresses in her life that weighed closer to 15. This is not comfortable in any sense a modern person would recognize as comfortable. It is, more accurately, a kind of architecture worn on the body, engineered to move in a specific and controlled way, to catch candlelight in a specific and controlled way, to announce from across a crowded room a specific and very precise level of wealth and taste, all without a single spoken word. The corset underneath all of it deserves an honest mention too, because there is a great deal of mythology around it that does not entirely match the historical reality. By 1893, extreme tight lacing to the point of genuine physical harm was considered, even within fashionable society, somewhat vulgar and old-fashioned, associated more with a slightly earlier decade than with the current one. Eleanor's corset is fitted to shape rather than to crush, though shape itself still required real, sustained pressure, and there is no honest way to describe 8 or 9 hours in one as anything other than a genuine physical undertaking, one she has simply grown so accustomed to across 20 years that she rarely thinks about it consciously anymore, the way you stop noticing the weight of a ring you have worn every day for 2 decades. Beauty itself, in this world, functioned as its own kind of performance, layered on top of everything else. A woman of Eleanor's position did not wear visible cosmetics, not in any way society would openly acknowledge, because visible cosmetics remained associated, unfairly and rather harshly, with actresses and with women of considerably lower social standing. And yet the actual practice of beauty, quietly, privately, was extensive. Rice powder applied so lightly it was meant to be invisible. A touch of colour worked into the lips with something that was absolutely not called lip colour, because that phrase would have been scandalous, but which achieved precisely the same effect through careful, deniable means. Almond oil worked into the hands each night, a specific vinegar rinse for the hair that Eleanor's mother taught her and that she still uses. One of the few beauty rituals in her life that predates any of this wealth at all, carried forward from a childhood considerably more modest than the one her own daughter is now living. And this brings us finally to the letter Eleanor sealed this morning, the one folded smaller than the others, because it connects directly to that thought, the modest childhood underneath all this marble. Eleanor was not always what she is now. Her family, while genuinely one tier above Charles's on the old unwritten scale, was never as wealthy as this house would suggest, and by the time Eleanor married, the family's fortune had already begun a slow, carefully hidden decline, the kind that respectable families of that era went to enormous lengths to conceal, because acknowledged poverty, even modest poverty, among the formerly wealthy carried a shame that outright never having had money simply did not. Eleanor has one sister, older by 4 years, named Catherine, who married a man of good character but modest means, a schoolteacher, and who lives now in a comfortable but genuinely unremarkable house in a town not far outside Boston, a life that would strike most of Eleanor's current circle as barely worth mentioning. Here is the thing nobody in this house, including Charles, fully understands, because Eleanor has never told him the full extent of it, not out of dishonesty exactly, more out of a private instinct to protect something that feels, somehow, entirely her own. Eleanor sends her sister money, has done so quietly for 11 years now, structured carefully so that it never once looks like charity, framed always as a gift, a birthday remembrance, help with a nephew's schooling, small enough on any single occasion to never draw comment, steady enough over time to have genuinely changed the shape of her sister's household. Catherine has never asked, Eleanor has never explained. It exists in the careful, unspoken language that sisters sometimes build between themselves, a language with its own private grammar that nobody outside it could ever fully read. I find this detail, honestly, the thing that stops me every time I sit with this story. This is a woman who spends her entire visible life inside an economy of appearance, where every gesture is calculated for how it will be seen and by whom, and then, quietly, in a small folded letter sealed a little more carefully than the others, she does something that is not performed for anyone at all. Nobody will ever compliment her on it. Nobody will ever know to compliment her on it. It exists entirely outside the scorekeeping that otherwise governs her every waking hour, and I think that is precisely why it matters to her as much as it does. It is the one part of her life that remains, in the truest sense, private. There is something else in this particular letter, something Eleanor has debated for weeks whether to include, and finally decided this morning that she would. Catherine's younger boy, Eleanor's nephew, is bright, genuinely and unusually bright according to his schoolteacher father, and there is a place, quietly arranged, waiting for him at a preparatory school in Connecticut should the family wish to send him, tuition already handled in a manner that will never be discussed directly between the sisters. Eleanor writes the offer as gently as she knows how, in language soft enough that Catherine could decline without any sense of having been pitied, because pity is the one thing Eleanor is determined never, under any circumstance, to allow into this particular correspondence. She seals the letter. She sets it on the tray for the afternoon post, and then she goes back to being, for the remainder of the day, entirely the woman everyone else believes her to be. While Eleanor is at Madame Rousseau's, Charles spends his afternoon in a world Eleanor rarely enters directly, though its consequences shape every hour of her day. He meets, this particular afternoon, with 2 other men of similar standing in a private room at a club that does not admit women at all, under any circumstances, a rule so absolute that Eleanor has never once set foot inside it, despite having lived, in effect, half her married life in its financial shadow. The meeting concerns a potential arrangement between their respective rail interests, the kind of quiet coordination that newspapers of the era would later come to describe, with growing suspicion, as evidence of monopoly, though none of the 3 men in that room this afternoon would have used that word about themselves. They would have called it, simply, good business, sound cooperation between reasonable men. The language people use to describe their own advantages rarely matches the language history eventually settles on. Charles is good at this work, genuinely good, in a way that has little to do with cruelty, despite what a modern reader might assume about a man who built this kind of fortune this quickly. He is, by most contemporary accounts of men like him, careful, exacting, and surprisingly patient, willing to wait years for an advantage rather than force one prematurely. He is also, and this is a detail people find interesting once they hear it, quietly generous in ways that never made the newspapers, because publicized generosity, in this era, was itself considered a form of vulgarity among certain of the older families, a display rather than a genuine gift. He funds, without his name ever attached to it, a portion of a hospital ward in the city, and has done so for years, a fact that even Eleanor only learnt by accident, from a conversation overheard rather than a confession offered. Husband and wife, it turns out, are each keeping something quietly private from the other, in a marriage that otherwise runs on 20 years of real, comfortable trust. I find that oddly touching, the idea that even inside a partnership this established, each person still holds one small room of themselves closed to the other, not from secrecy exactly, more from the simple human instinct to keep some part of your goodness unwitnessed. Henry, meanwhile, spends his afternoon in a manner considerably less consequential, and considerably more typical of a 19-year-old given every advantage and not yet required to do very much with any of them. He rides in the park with two friends from Yale who are also home for the stretch, their horses' hooves loud against paths kept immaculately maintained specifically for this purpose, and afterward the three of them sit for a while at a private club of their own, a younger, louder version of the one Charles occupies, where they discuss, with the particular seriousness only very young men manage, questions of business and marriage and the future, none of which they have yet actually had to face in any real way. Henry will eventually be expected to take some meaningful role in his father's business, though what exactly that role will look like remains, this particular autumn, genuinely undecided, a source of quiet tension between father and son that neither has yet said aloud. Marian's afternoon is quieter, and in some ways more private than anyone else's in the house. She has a tutor who comes 3 afternoons a week, an arrangement continued past what many families of her exact circle would consider necessary for a girl her age, because Eleanor, for reasons that trace directly back to her own girlhood, insisted on it. French conversation, some history, more literature than strict etiquette would technically require, though never anything that might be described, even privately, as unusual or bookish, because unusual was its own kind of social risk for a young woman about to enter society. Marian reads more than her tutor assigns, quietly, in the evenings, novels she keeps on a shelf her mother has never once inspected, and if you asked her honestly what she actually wants from the coming season, from the debut, from the marriage that will presumably follow it within a few years, she would need a long moment before answering, because the honest answer is more complicated than the version she has been trained since childhood to give. By 5 in the afternoon, the household begins its slow, deliberate shift toward the evening, and this transition deserves its own attention, because 30 guests arriving for a formal dinner did not simply happen. It was constructed, hour by hour, over the course of the entire day, by a staff of nearly 20 people working in careful, largely invisible coordination. The kitchen, under Delacroix, has been preparing components of tonight's 9-course meal since early morning, some elements, the stocks, the pastry work, requiring a full day or longer of preparation before they ever reach a plate. Flowers arrived at midday from a florist who has serviced this exact family for 6 years, and who understands, without needing to be told twice, precisely which arrangements Eleanor prefers for which rooms. The table itself, the same one being polished by a maid on her knees at 6 that morning, has by late afternoon been laid with a full formal service, china imported from a specific manufacturer in France, crystal that catches the new electric light in a way the household's decorator specifically engineered the fixtures to achieve, silver polished to a standard that a modern household would consider almost obsessive. Eleanor begins dressing for the evening a little after 6, in a process that takes close to 2 hours from first pin to final clasp, though I do not want to dwell too long on the mechanics of it, because the more interesting part of this hour, honestly, is not the dressing itself but the quiet that surrounds it. Her lady's maid works efficiently and mostly silently, having done this so many times across so many years that the two of them communicate now in small gestures more than words. A raised eyebrow that means the pin is not quite right, a slight nod that means proceed. Eleanor uses this hour, oddly, as one of the few genuinely restful stretches in her entire day. Not because being dressed is restful in any physical sense, corsets and pins being what they are, but because it requires no performance at all. Nobody is watching who needs to be managed. She can simply sit and be dressed and think about nothing in particular, or everything in particular, depending on the evening. The jewelry chosen tonight includes a necklace that belonged to Charles's mother, a woman Eleanor met only twice before her death, and knows mostly through this single object and the handful of stories Charles occasionally tells about her. It is not the most valuable piece in Eleanor's collection, not by a considerable margin, but she chooses it more often than pieces worth several times as much, and if you asked her why, she would say only that she likes it, in a tone that closes the question rather than inviting further discussion. I think there is something worth noticing in that too, the way this entire evening, built almost entirely around display, still leaves small pockets of genuine private feeling tucked into the corners of it, a favourite necklace, a grandmother's tea service, a folded letter to a sister 200 miles away. By 7:30 the first guests begin arriving, and the choreography of a dinner at this level of society was, itself, a small performance requiring precision most modern hosts would find genuinely exhausting to contemplate. 30 guests, arriving within a tightly managed window of perhaps 40 minutes, each greeted personally, each guided with practiced ease toward the drawing room, where a brief period of conversation, never longer than half an hour, allowed everyone to settle before dinner itself was announced. The order in which guests entered the dining room, and the order in which they were seated once there, followed rules of precedence so detailed that entire etiquette manuals devoted chapters to nothing else, rules governing exactly who should be escorted by whom, based on rank, age, marital status, and a dozen finer distinctions that a woman like Eleanor could move through instantly and instinctively, the way you cross a room you have walked through 10,000 times without ever needing to look down at your feet. Among tonight's guests is a woman named Augusta Pierpont, and I want to introduce her properly, because the quiet tension between her and Eleanor is going to shape a good portion of this evening, and it connects directly back to that rumour from last spring I mentioned earlier. Augusta belongs to one of the oldest families at the table, wealth reaching back well over a century, and she has never entirely warmed to Eleanor, not out of any single dramatic grievance, but out of the accumulated low-grade friction that exists between women who are, whether either would admit it aloud, in genuine and ongoing competition for the same finite pool of social influence. The rumour in question concerned a charitable committee both women sit on, and a whispered suggestion, never traced back to any confirmed source, that Eleanor had manoeuvred to have herself named chair over a candidate Augusta had quietly favoured. Whether Eleanor actually did manoeuvre for the position, or whether the position simply fell to her through ordinary circumstance, is a question Eleanor herself might answer differently depending on her mood and the honesty of the moment, but the effect on her friendship with Augusta was immediate and has not fully healed across 6 months. Watching the two of them tonight, across the drawing room before dinner, is its own small education in the art of controlled hostility. They greet each other with genuine warmth, at least on the surface. Augusta's compliment on Eleanor's gown delivered with a smile that does not entirely reach her eyes. Eleanor's response, equally warm, equally precise, containing a small compliment of her own that manages, somehow, to reference Augusta's daughter's recent engagement in a way that is technically gracious and pointedly reminds the room that Augusta's daughter, 2 years older than Marian, is only now becoming engaged, a fact Augusta would very much prefer nobody dwell on this particular evening. Neither woman raises her voice. Neither woman says a single word that could, if repeated, be called unkind. And yet everyone at that end of the room understands, with total clarity, exactly what has just occurred. Dinner is announced at 8, and the meal itself unfolds across 9 courses and nearly 3 hours, and I want to walk through some of it slowly, because there is a genuine pleasure in the specific detail here. the kind of pleasure that has nothing to do with drama and everything to do with simply picturing the room correctly. The first course, a clear consommé, arrives in shallow gilded bowls, followed by a fish course, then a small entree, then a sorbet served specifically to cleanse the palate before the main course arrives, a practice borrowed wholesale from French formal dining and adopted with total seriousness by American households wealthy enough to bother. The main course tonight is a roasted saddle of lamb, dressed with a sauce Delacroix has been refining for years and refuses to share the exact recipe of even with his own kitchen staff, followed by a salad course, a cheese course, and finally dessert, an elaborate spun sugar construction that took 2 kitchen staff the better part of the afternoon to assemble, and that draws a small, genuine gasp from several guests when it is carried in. Each course is paired with its own wine, chosen and served by a butler named Whitmore, who has run this household's dining service for 9 years, and who possesses by this point an almost complete internal map of which guests prefer their glasses topped generously and which prefer to be left largely alone, a small kindness of attentiveness that almost nobody at the table consciously registers because good service, at this level, is specifically designed to be invisible. You are meant to notice only that your glass is never empty and never overfull, never that a person made this happen through careful, continuous observation across 3 hours of standing quietly at the edge of a room he is not permitted to speak in unless spoken to first. The conversation around the table moves, as it always does, on 2 levels at once. Charles, seated near the head of the table beside a business associate's wife, discusses, in general and carefully bland terms suitable for mixed company, the state of the rail expansion out toward the Western Territories, a subject he can speak on for hours if permitted, and generally is not, because dinner conversation of this era discouraged any single guest from dominating too long on a subject that might exclude others. Eleanor, seated at the opposite end as the hostess is expected to be, keeps the flow of conversation moving among her own end of the table with the same quiet skill she showed at lunch, drawing a quieter guest gently into a conversation, redirecting a slightly too pointed comment from another before it can land awkwardly, and doing all of it while appearing to do almost nothing at all beyond simply enjoying her own dinner party. There is a moment around the 5th course when the conversation drifts toward a topic that makes several people at the table visibly uncomfortable, though nobody says so directly. A guest mentions, in passing, a family recently and rather publicly ruined, a name everyone at the table recognizes, a fortune that seemed only 2 years earlier, every bit as secure as the one currently surrounding this very table, collapsed now through a combination of bad investment and worse luck, the family itself having quietly left the city altogether rather than remain and be watched. The silence that follows this mention lasts only a second or two, but it is a real silence, and Eleanor, sensing it, moves the conversation gently elsewhere within moments, toward the opera, toward a much safer subject. But I think that brief silence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something true about the actual psychological weight underneath all this splendor. Every person at this table understands, at some level they rarely allow themselves to examine directly, that the ground they are standing on, however solid it currently feels, is not actually guaranteed. Fortunes in this era could and did collapse, sometimes within a single bad season, and the same social machinery that so thoroughly celebrates wealth is entirely capable of turning, swiftly and without much sentiment, on a family that loses it. Marian, seated further down the table between 2 young men roughly her own age, both of them the sons of families her mother has quietly, carefully placed her near tonight, manages the conversation with a poise that surprises even Eleanor when she glances down the table to check on her daughter, as she does perhaps a dozen times across the course of the meal without ever appearing to. Marian has clearly absorbed more of her mother's particular skill than either of them has ever discussed directly, the skill of listening more than speaking, of asking a question that invites a young man to talk about himself at length while revealing very little about her own actual thoughts, of laughing at precisely the right moments without ever seeming to perform the laughter. Eleanor feels, watching this, a complicated mixture of pride and something closer to grief, a recognition that her daughter is stepping into the exact same careful, constrained, exhausting performance that has shaped Eleanor's entire adult life, and that there is, within this world, no real alternative to offer her. When dinner finally ends, close to 11, the guests move through into the drawing room, and here the evening's rhythm shifts once more. In many households of this exact era, the men and women would separate at this point, the men retiring briefly to a smoking room for cigars and brandy, and conversation considered unsuitable for mixed company, the women remaining in the drawing room for their own separate conversation, before eventually reconverging for a final hour of music or cards before guests began to depart. The Whitfield household follows this pattern tonight, and Charles disappears with several of the men into his study, now doubling as tonight's smoking room, where the conversation, freed from the careful neutrality required at the dinner table, drifts more openly toward business, toward politics, toward a candid assessment of exactly which of tonight's other guests are currently thriving and which are, more quietly, beginning to struggle. Eleanor remains in the drawing room with the women, and this hour, freed from the men's presence, has its own distinct character, warmer in some ways than the dinner table, sharper in others. It is here, in this particular hour, more than almost anywhere else in the social calendar, that real information changes hands. Augusta, seated now near Eleanor rather than across a table from her, softens slightly, the earlier tension between them settling into something closer to their usual working truce, and the two of them fall into a conversation about a mutual friend's health that carries, underneath its surface concern, a great deal of unspoken calculation about what that friend's declining health might mean for a marriage currently being arranged between two families neither Eleanor nor Augusta is directly connected to, but both are, in the way of this world, quietly interested in regardless. A younger guest, newly married and still finding her footing in this particular circle, asks Eleanor a question about a charitable committee, and Eleanor answers with real warmth, remembering perhaps her own early uncertain seasons in rooms exactly like this one, 20 years ago now, though she keeps that memory entirely to herself. There is a kindness in Eleanor that exists alongside all the careful strategy, not separate from it exactly, but layered underneath it, the way a person can be both genuinely generous and genuinely calculating within the very same gesture, without either quality cancelling out the other. I think that is one of the more honest things to understand about a woman like Eleanor, and about this world more broadly. The performance and the sincerity are not opposites. They live in the same body, the same hour, sometimes the same sentence. The men rejoin the women a little before midnight, and the evening's final hour settles into music. Eleanor plays for a while, not the technically demanding pieces she practices alone in the mornings when nobody is listening, but lighter, more sociable music suited to a room full of half-attentive conversation continuing quietly underneath it. A guest with a genuinely fine singing voice, a young man connected to one of the families at the table, performs 2 songs while Eleanor accompanies him, and the room falls into an easy, unhurried appreciation that feels, for a few minutes, almost like the evening has stopped being a performance at all, and simply become an evening. I think these small pockets are worth noticing wherever they appear in a story like this one. Underneath all the strategy and the scorekeeping, real pleasure did exist here too, real music, real laughter, real affection between people who had also, an hour earlier, been quietly measuring one another's social standing over consommé. Guests begin departing a little after midnight, in the same careful, choreographed order they arrived. Farewells extended at the door, with warmth calibrated as precisely as everything else this evening. Whitmore and 2 footmen managing coats and carriages, with the same invisible efficiency that carried the entire night. Augusta is among the last to leave, and at the door she takes Eleanor's hand for a moment longer than strict etiquette requires, and says something quiet, something about the committee, something that sounds, in tone if not entirely in content, like the beginning of an actual thaw between them. Eleanor will think about that small gesture more than she expects to over the following days. 6 months of careful distance, and it takes a single unremarkable moment at a doorway to begin loosening it. People are strange that way. Even people who have spent decades learning to be strategic remain, underneath it, simply people, capable of being moved by small kindnesses they did not entirely expect. By 1 in the morning, the last carriage has pulled away down the avenue, its wheels loud against the cobblestones in a street gone otherwise quiet. and the house begins its slow transition back into itself. The staff moves through the rooms, clearing what 30 guests and 9 courses inevitably leave behind, work that will continue for another hour at least before the last of them finally goes to bed themselves, in rooms on the upper floors that none of tonight's guests will ever see or think about. Marion says goodnight to her parents in the hall, her face carrying the particular exhausted glow of a young woman who has just successfully made it through her first real test of the coming season, and disappears upstairs. Henry, who spent the later part of the evening in quiet conversation with one of the young men from dinner about horses, and about Yale, and about nothing of any real consequence, follows shortly after. Charles and Eleanor climb the stairs together, and this last hour of their day, much like Constance's evening in a house across an ocean, carries a different texture entirely from everything that preceded it. In her dressing room, with her maid dismissed for the night, having done the heaviest work of unpinning and unlacing already, Eleanor finishes undressing herself in a slow, unhurried quiet she genuinely treasures. The corset finally released after 9 hours, a physical relief she has learnt not to comment on because commenting on it would be, in its own small way, an admission that the whole apparatus is a burden, and admitting that plainly is not something this world particularly rewards. Charles comes in partway through, still in his shirt sleeves, and sits on the edge of the chaise near her dressing table, the way he has for 20 years, and they talk. This conversation, unlike almost every other conversation either of them has had today, requires no management at all. Charles tells her, briefly, about the arrangement discussed at the club that afternoon, more than he would ever say at a dinner table, because this room is the one place in his entire life where the careful public restraint around business talk simply does not apply. Eleanor tells him, in turn, about Augusta's small thaw at the door, about a moment during the fish course when she caught a look pass between 2 guests that suggested an engagement neither family has yet announced. They do not talk about money, not directly, that unspoken rule holding even here, in the privacy of their own rooms, though they talk around it constantly, in the coded language of committees and calls and which family seems to be thriving and which does not. It occurs to me, thinking about this couple, that a marriage built this deeply inside a world of performance still manages to carve out, somehow, a genuine private register of its own, a shorthand, an ease, 20 years of simply knowing each other that no amount of social calculation ever fully touches. Eleanor thinks, once Charles has gone to his own room, and the house has finally gone properly quiet, about the letter she sent to Catherine that morning, and wonders, not for the first time, what her sister's evening looked like tonight, 200 miles north, in a house considerably smaller than the room Eleanor is currently sitting in. A simpler dinner, without question, no orchestra of staff, no 9 courses, no careful choreography of arrivals and departures. And yet Eleanor finds herself, in this particular quiet hour, genuinely uncertain which evening she would choose if some impossible hand offered her the choice cleanly, without consequence. She does not resolve the thought, she simply lets it sit there, unfinished, the way real thoughts at 1 in the morning tend to remain unfinished, and reaches instead for the small oil lamp beside her bed, the electric fixtures throughout the house switched off for the night by habit and by economy, both because even a fortune this size does not fully erase the older instincts a person carries from a less certain childhood. Let me widen the frame here for a moment, because I think it helps to understand where this single evening sits inside something much larger. The period we call the Gilded Age, roughly the decade spanning the end of the Civil War through the very beginning of the 20th century, produced wealth in America at a scale and a speed the country had genuinely never witnessed before. Wealth concentrated overwhelmingly in the hands of a remarkably small number of families, the Whitfields among them, standing in tonight for dozens of real households who lived lives structurally very close to the one we have spent this evening inside. The term itself, Gilded Age, came from a novel written jointly by 2 authors in the 1870s, and it was meant, quite deliberately, as something less than flattering. Gilded, not golden, a surface of gold laid thin over something considerably less precious underneath, a pointed observation about an era that dressed itself in extraordinary splendor, while, only a few streets away from houses exactly like this one, entire families lived in genuine and serious deprivation, crowded into tenement housing with none of the safety, sanitation, or basic security that this household simply assumes as background conditions of existence. This contrast was not hidden or subtle, and contemporary observers wrote about it constantly, with varying degrees of outrage and varying degrees of resignation. A single dinner like the one hosted tonight, 9 courses, imported wine, an orchestra of specialized staff, likely cost more than a working family in the tenements a few miles south would see in wages across an entire year, sometimes several years. Eleanor is aware of this disparity in the abstract way that most people in her position were aware of it, acknowledged occasionally through the socially acceptable channel of charitable committees and hospital funding, the kind of giving that allowed enormous wealth to feel, to itself, generous and responsible, without ever requiring any fundamental change to the structure that produced the disparity in the first place. I do not say this to condemn Eleanor specifically. She is, in most of the ways this story has tried to show you tonight, a genuinely thoughtful, genuinely kind woman operating entirely within the assumptions of the world she was raised inside. Assumptions so complete and so total that questioning them would have required a kind of imagination almost nobody around her possessed either. The fortunes built during this era, Charles is among them, reshaped the physical landscape of the country in ways that outlasted the families themselves by well over a century. The rail lines Charles's steel helped build still, in modified form, carry freight across the same routes today. Many of the mansions built along Fifth Avenue and in Newport, and in a handful of other concentrated pockets of extraordinary wealth, were, within a few decades of tonight's dinner party, already being demolished, torn down by descendants who could no longer afford the staff required to maintain them, or converted into institutions, museums, schools, consulates, their ballrooms repurposed for entirely different uses than the ones they were built for. A handful survive today more or less as they were, preserved specifically because they represent, so completely, a moment in American life that simply does not exist anymore and likely never will again in quite the same form, a concentration of private domestic splendor that even today's considerable fortunes rarely attempt to replicate in quite this particular architectural language. There is a second house worth mentioning here because it explains something important about how families like the Whitfields actually organized their year. This Fifth Avenue mansion is, properly speaking, only the winter residence. Every summer, from roughly July through the early part of September, the entire household, family, and a significant portion of the staff both relocates to Newport, Rhode Island, to a house the family calls, with a modesty that fools absolutely nobody, their cottage. The word itself became, across this era, a kind of private joke among the wealthy families who used it, because these cottages routinely ran to 50 rooms or more, built directly on the Atlantic cliffs with lawns sweeping down toward the water, designed by the same handful of fashionable architects who built the Fifth Avenue mansions, and furnished with an even more theatrical excess than the winter houses, because Newport summers existed almost entirely for entertainment, for lawn parties and yacht races and evening balls, held with the ocean itself as a kind of backdrop. The Newport season carries its own particular rhythm, considerably more relaxed on the surface than the winter social calendar, and underneath that relaxed surface, every bit as competitive. Eleanor thinks of Newport, honestly, as harder work than the winter months in some ways, because the entertaining there is nearly constant, day after day for close to 10 weeks, house parties and picnics and evening entertainments, strung together with barely a pause between them, all conducted in an atmosphere of studied casualness that took, in Eleanor's experience, considerably more planning to achieve than the more openly formal winter season ever required. There is something almost paradoxical in that, the idea that appearing effortlessly relaxed demanded more effort than simply being formal, but I think anyone who has ever tried to throw a genuinely easy, unhurried gathering knows exactly what Eleanor means. Ease, real ease, especially the kind meant to be witnessed and admired, is often the hardest thing in the world to actually produce. I want to mention something about where a meaningful portion of these fortunes eventually went, because it complicates the picture in a way I find genuinely worth sitting with. Many of the families operating at this exact level of wealth during these decades, once their fortunes reached a certain scale, began directing extraordinary sums toward what we would now call philanthropy, funding libraries that still stand and still lend books today in towns across the entire country, funding universities and hospitals and museums that remain, more than a century later, among the most significant cultural and educational institutions in America. This impulse was not universal, and it was not always free of self-interest, a library named for a family being its own quiet form of the same display we have watched all evening in smaller domestic form. But the actual, material effect of it was real and considerable, and it sits alongside the genuine inequality of the era in a way that resists any simple, tidy verdict. The same economic structure that allowed a single family to spend more on one dinner than most households saw in years also produced, eventually, some of the institutions that later generations, including people who would never have been welcome at Eleanor's table, benefited from directly. History rarely offers the clean moral shape we might prefer it to have. This era does not offer it either. Eleanor, lying in her bed now with the small oil lamp finally extinguished, thinks briefly, in the hazy way thoughts arrive right before sleep, about Marian's actual debut in January, still months away, the ball that tonight's dinner was, in its own quiet way, a rehearsal for. She pictures the ballroom on the second floor, currently closed off and dust-sheeted, waiting the way it waits 360 days out of every year, imagines it filled with several hundred guests, imagines Marian in white, the traditional colour for a debutante, standing at the top of the staircase before her formal entrance, a moment Eleanor remembers with total physical clarity from her own debut 26 years earlier, the particular quality of fear and excitement braided together so tightly that even now, decades later, she can still feel an echo of it in her chest when she lets herself remember properly. She hopes, in the specific, complicated way a mother hopes for a daughter she loves inside a world she has mixed feelings about, that Marian's season goes well, that the marriage that eventually follows it brings her daughter something like the genuine, comfortable partnership Eleanor herself found with Charles, rather than merely the successful transaction the season is technically designed to produce. She hopes, too, somewhere underneath that more practical hope, that Marian finds some version of what Eleanor found in that folded letter to Catherine this morning, some private room inside an otherwise fully performed life that belongs to nobody but herself. Whether Marian will find that, or whether she will simply learn, as most women of her circle eventually learned, to build one anyway, quietly, out of whatever material happened to be available to her, is not a question tonight's story can answer. It is still months, years, an entire unwritten future away. The house itself, at this hour, deserves its own attention, because a mansion this size, fully quiet, is a genuinely different place than the one we walked through at the start of the evening. The main hall, empty now, holds a particular kind of silence that only very large rooms seem able to produce, a silence with a faint echo folded into it, the marble floor cool and pale under what little light drifts down from the one lamp Whitmore leaves burning low near the staircase until the last of the staff has finally gone up themselves. The ballroom on the second floor sits behind closed doors, dust sheets over the furniture pushed to its edges, chandeliers wrapped in soft cloth, waiting through another ordinary night the way it waits through nearly all of them. Somewhere below, in the kitchen, the last of Delacroix's staff finish the true final task of the day, banking the great iron stove for the night, the coals settling into a low orange glow that will keep something like warmth alive in that room until the first kitchen maid arrives again before dawn to wake the fire properly. Outside, Fifth Avenue has gone as quiet as it ever gets, which is to say, not entirely quiet, but close. A single carriage passes, late, its wheels loud and then fading. A gas lamp 2 doors down flickers slightly, an older fixture in a house that has not yet converted to electric light the way the Whitfields have, and somewhere further off, faint enough to be almost imagined, the low sound of the harbour, ships and water, and the particular hum a large port city makes even at 1 in the morning, never fully silent, never fully still. Eleanor has always found this specific hour, this specific mixture of grand interior silence and faint distant city sound, strangely comforting, though she has never described it that way to anyone, not even Charles, because it is the kind of small, private observation that does not translate easily into the language this world usually asks her to speak. I mentioned, near the very beginning of tonight's story, a maid on her knees at 6 in the morning, polishing table legs nobody would ever comment on. I want to return to her now, briefly, because I think she deserves a proper ending too, even a small one. Her name, as it happens, is Sarah, and by this hour, well past 1 in the morning, she has been asleep for some time already in a narrow room on the topmost floor of the house, sharing it with another housemaid, in quarters considerably plainer than anything we have described tonight, a single window, a washstand far smaller than the one in Eleanor's dressing room, a bed she will rise from again in under 5 hours, to begin the entire enormous machine of this household turning once more. Sarah's life, her actual interior life, her hopes, her private letters if she writes any, her own version of Eleanor's folded note to Catherine, sits almost entirely outside what history bothered recording about houses like this one. We know Eleanor's name because Eleanor's name appeared in newspapers and guest books and the occasional surviving letter. We know considerably less, in most cases, about the Sarahs, though there were in every one of these households far more of them than there were of anyone at tonight's dinner table. I do not say this to darken the evening, and I want to be careful here, because that is not where tonight's story is trying to take you. It is simply a piece of honesty I think belongs somewhere inside A Night About Extraordinary Wealth, a reminder that every gilded surface in this story rested on a great deal of ordinary, largely unrecorded labour, most of it performed by people whose names, unlike Eleanor's, rarely survived the century. The two things can sit together without cancelling each other out. The splendour was real. The labour underneath it was real too. Both are part of the same true picture, and a story that only showed you one would not actually be telling you the truth about this era at all. Let me widen the frame once more, because there is something worth saying about the women who did eventually step outside the exact role Eleanor occupies so completely tonight. This era produced its own quiet handful of women who used inherited or married wealth towards something considerably more consequential than a well-run dinner party. Women who funded and helped organize the settlement house movement, bringing education and basic services directly into the immigrant neighborhoods, only a short carriage ride from houses exactly like the Whitfields. Women who pushed, often for decades and against considerable resistance, for causes ranging from public health reform to women's suffrage, using precisely the same social connections and committee structures that governed Eleanor's afternoon calls, but bending those structures toward genuinely different ends. None of these women were entirely free of the constraints wrapped around Eleanor's own life. Even the most reform-minded among them still operated inside a world that expected certain performances, certain silences, certain careful negotiations of exactly how far a woman could push before the door closed on her entirely. But they pushed anyway, some of them considerably further than Eleanor ever will, and their names, unlike Sarah's, mostly did survive, carried forward in the institutions they helped build, many of which still exist in some form today. Eleanor is not one of these women, not in any way history will remember specifically. She will not found a hospital ward under her own name, will not march for any cause, will not appear in the history books that get written about this era decades later, except perhaps as a single line in a society column, reprinted somewhere, a name attached to a dinner party, a gown, a season. And yet I do not think that makes her life a smaller one, exactly, only a more private one, its real substance folded into places history was never particularly good at looking, a folded letter to a sister, a quiet gift of tuition offered without any expectation of thanks, a necklace worn not because it is valuable, but because it once belonged to someone she loved through her husband, and love, even borrowed second-hand through a husband's memory, still counts as something real. Let us think for a moment about the seasons of a life like this one, rather than simply the season of one particular year, because I think it helps to understand where tonight sits inside something considerably longer. Eleanor at 44 stands roughly at the midpoint of what this world would consider her active social career, past the anxious early years of establishing herself after marriage, not yet arrived at the quieter, more settled authority that women of her circle sometimes reach in their 50s and 60s, when decades of careful cultivation finally mature into something that requires less daily maintenance and simply exists, largely on its own momentum. The next several years will be dominated almost entirely by Marian, by the debut in January and whatever marriage eventually follows it, and by Henry's slower, more uncertain path into his father's business, a transition Eleanor suspects will take longer and prove more difficult than either Charles or Henry currently expects, though she has said nothing about this to either of them, filing the observation away the way she files most of her sharper insights, privately, for now. Further out, in a stretch of years none of tonight's guests spent much time thinking about at dinner, the world this house exists inside will begin, slowly and then considerably less slowly, to shift underneath it. Income tax, essentially unknown to fortunes like Charles's in 1893, will arrive within Eleanor's own lifetime and will change, permanently, the calculus of maintaining a household on this exact scale. The great mansions along this stretch of avenue, built to seem as though they would stand essentially forever, will begin coming down within a few decades, their owners' descendants finding the cost of staff and upkeep simply impossible to sustain in a changed economic world. The marble and the imported plasterwork sold for salvage, or simply demolished outright, to make way for the apartment buildings and commercial towers that a later New York would prefer instead. Newport's cottages will fare somewhat better, several of them eventually preserved as museums, precisely because their scale made them useless for almost anything except being looked at, which turned out, in the end, to be exactly what they were always best suited for. None of this touches tonight, of course. Tonight the house stands exactly as it was built to stand, and the family inside it moves through an evening that feels, to every person present, entirely permanent, entirely secure, the natural and continuing order of things rather than one particular arrangement among many that history would eventually rearrange. I think there is something worth sitting with in that gap, the distance between how permanent a moment feels while you are inside it and how temporary it often turns out to have been. It is not a sad thought exactly, or at least it does not have to be. It simply describes the shape of time itself, the way every grand and glittering evening, however solid it feels, is also, quietly, already becoming a memory even as it happens. There is a smaller, gentler version of this same thought that applies more directly to Eleanor's own evening, and I want to close on it rather than on anything larger. Somewhere in a drawer in her writing desk downstairs sits a stack of old calling cards, invitations, small mementos from evenings considerably less grand than tonight's, gathered across 20 years of exactly this kind of life. She keeps them not for any strategic reason, no scorekeeping purpose the way so much of her day operates, but simply because she likes having them, small paper evidence of an accumulated life she does not examine often but is glad, in some quiet way, to know is there. I think most of us keep some version of that drawer, whatever our own particular life looks like, whatever scale it happens to occupy, small unremarkable proof that we were here, that an evening happened, that it mattered to someone, even if history never bothers to record it properly. I want to take you somewhere slightly different for a while now, because Eleanor's house, however grand, is really just one house among perhaps 24 operating at this exact level, scattered across a few blocks of Manhattan and a stretch of Newport cliffside, and there is something worth understanding in how these households related to one another, not just through gossip and rivalry, which we have already spent time on tonight, but through the sheer physical logistics of an entire social world moving in loose coordination across an entire year. The social calendar itself functioned almost like a single enormous shared machine, its gears turned collectively by dozens of families who each believed privately that they alone were setting the pace, when in truth the whole system moved together, season into season, in a rhythm none of them had designed so much as inherited. The winter season in New York ran, broadly, from November through the early weeks of Lent, a schedule that traced back, whether anyone particularly thought about it this way or not, to older European social calendars built around the church year, adapted loosely and somewhat unconsciously into this newer, considerably more secular American version. Within that stretch, certain evenings carried more weight than others. The opening of the opera season, always a significant occasion, functioned as much as a social event as a musical one. Boxes at the opera house assigned by subscription in an arrangement so tightly controlled that which family held which box, and where that box sat relative to the stage, communicated social position almost as precisely as a guest list did. Eleanor and Charles hold a box in a location that took Charles nearly 4 years of careful cultivation to secure, moving up gradually from a considerably less desirable position when they first married, a fact Eleanor still feels a small, private satisfaction about every single time she takes her seat there. Christmas itself, in this household, carries a character that might surprise a modern listener expecting something closer to a quiet family holiday. It was, in truth, one of the more genuinely private moments of the entire calendar, one of the few occasions when the Whitfields entertained nobody at all beyond immediate family, and Eleanor treasures it precisely for that rarity. The tree, an American adaptation of a tradition still relatively new to this exact social class, having been popularized within living memory largely through fashionable European example, stands in the main hall rather than the more private family rooms, decorated with ornaments Eleanor has collected across 2 decades of marriage, several of them gifts from Charles himself, chosen with a thoughtfulness that surprises people who only know him through his reputation in business. Marian and Henry, whatever their ages, still open gifts on Christmas morning with something close to genuine childhood delight, a small unguarded pocket of the year when the careful performance required almost everywhere else in their lives simply falls away for a few hours. There is another family worth mentioning briefly tonight, not because their story intersects directly with the Whitfields, but because their example illustrates something true about how quickly fortune and reputation could shift in this era, a pattern Eleanor thinks about more than she lets on. A family the Whitfields know only slightly, through the outer edges of their social circle, built their fortune rapidly through mining interests out west, arrived in New York with genuinely staggering wealth, larger in raw terms than almost anyone else's at the time, and spent nearly a decade attempting, with escalating and increasingly desperate extravagance, to purchase acceptance from the older families who continued, quietly and immovably, to keep them at arm's length regardless of how large their ballroom grew, or how many European titles they eventually married their daughters into. Money alone, it turned out, however enormous, could buy proximity to this world, but could not always buy genuine belonging, at least not within a single generation, and the particular anguish of watching that specific limitation play out, again and again, across families who had everything except the one thing they wanted most, is one of the stranger, sadder undercurrents running beneath the sparkle of this entire era. Eleanor, who arrived at her own position through the more fortunate combination of an established family name and a husband's newer fortune, has watched this particular drama unfold from a comfortable distance for years, with a mixture of genuine sympathy and, if she is honest with herself in the way she rarely allows herself to be even privately, a small measure of relief that her own path required considerably less humiliation to walk. It is a small, uncomfortable thought, and she does not linger on it long tonight, letting it drift past the way she lets most uncomfortable thoughts drift past, filed away rather than fully examined, which is, in its own way, another one of the quiet skills this entire world has taught her across 20 years of practice. There is a room on the 2nd floor of the house we have not properly visited yet tonight, and it deserves a few minutes, because it says something true about how families at this level thought about culture, and how that thinking has aged in ways that might surprise you. Charles's picture gallery, a long room running along the northern side of the house, houses a collection he has built over roughly 15 years, advised by a dealer who travels regularly to Europe specifically to source paintings for clients exactly like him. There is something almost comic, in retrospect, about how quickly and how systematically fortunes made in steel and rail were converted into old master paintings and Renaissance furniture, entire centuries of European aristocratic culture purchased, crated, and shipped across an ocean within a single generation, as though history itself could simply be acquired the same way a rail line could be acquired, provided you had sufficient capital and sufficient patience, and in a strange way it worked, at least in the very long run. Many of these hastily assembled American collections, built by men whose grandparents had no connection whatsoever to European aristocracy, eventually became the founding core of major museums that still stand today, their names, families exactly like the Whitfields, attached permanently to wings and galleries that millions of people walk through now, without necessarily knowing or caring how the collection first arrived on this side of the ocean. Charles has not yet decided what becomes of his own collection eventually, whether it stays within the family or eventually finds its way into some public institution, the way several of his peers' collections already have. But he thinks about it more than Eleanor realizes, standing in this gallery some evenings alone after the household has gone quiet, looking at paintings he genuinely loves, not merely display pieces to him, but objects that have taught him, across 15 years of careful looking, to see the world slightly differently than the practical, numbers-driven way business first trained him to see it. The household staff itself, 20 people working across this one house alone, not counting the Newport staff or the farm staff maintained separately outside the city, operated with its own internal hierarchy every bit as precise and every bit as consequential to the people living inside it as the hierarchy governing the family upstairs. Whitmore, as butler, sat at the top of this structure, answering directly to Charles and Eleanor and to almost nobody else, commanding a respect from the rest of the staff that in some ways exceeded what a junior member of the family itself might receive. Below him, a housekeeper named Mrs. Pruitt managed the female staff and the household's day-to-day domestic operations with an authority every bit as absolute within her own sphere. Footmen, housemaids, kitchen staff, each occupying a specific rung, each rung carrying its own subtle distinctions in uniform, in pay, in which staircase a person was permitted to use, the grand front stairs reserved entirely for family and guests, a separate, considerably narrower and steeper set of back stairs used by every single member of staff for every single task, all day, every day, invisible passageways threaded through the walls of the house like a second parallel building hidden inside the visible one. I find that image genuinely striking, honestly, whenever I sit with it properly. Two separate versions of the same house, existing simultaneously in the same physical space, one grand and visible and meant to be seen, the other narrow and hidden and meant specifically not to be, and an entire staff of 20 people moving constantly between the two, stepping out of the hidden version into the visible one only when a specific task required it, then disappearing back into the walls the moment that task was finished. It is architecture built, quite literally, around the principle of invisible labor, and I think that principle tells you as much about this era as any of the marble or the gold leaf or the imported silk we have spent tonight admiring. Let me tell you about travel for a family like this one, because it is one of the more genuinely fascinating aspects of this whole world, and it connects directly to something Eleanor is already planning, quietly, for next spring. Every second or third year, roughly, the Whitfields cross the Atlantic, a journey that in 1893 takes close to a week aboard one of the great steamships, and which the family undertakes not as a single unified trip, but almost as its own small travelling household, an entourage that includes several members of staff, an almost absurd quantity of trunks and cases, and an itinerary planned months in advance with nearly the same precision Eleanor applies to a dinner party guest list. Paris first, always, for several weeks, partly for genuine pleasure, and partly because a wardrobe assembled through the right Parisian houses carried a social weight back in New York that no American dressmaker, however skilled, could quite replicate. London next, where Eleanor maintains a small circle of English acquaintances built up across several previous visits, women whose own social world runs on rules subtly different from New York's, but recognizable enough that Eleanor moves through them with relative ease. Perhaps Italy, if time allows, mostly for Charles's benefit, feeding the same eye that built his picture gallery, standing in rooms and churches that have stood for centuries in a country where, refreshingly for him, nobody particularly cares how recently his own family acquired its wealth. These trips were not simply vacations in the way we would use that word today. They functioned as a kind of ongoing education, a deliberate cultivation of taste and worldliness that a family like the Whitfields needed to display convincingly, because raw wealth alone, however enormous, was never quite sufficient in this world without the accompanying appearance of genuine cultivation, an ability to discuss European art and architecture and history with real demonstrated familiarity rather than merely second-hand enthusiasm. Marion has crossed the Atlantic 4 times already in her 17 years, and Eleanor is already thinking ahead to a longer European trip planned for after the debut season concludes, partly for pleasure and partly, quietly, as a strategic pause, giving Marian a graceful interval of a year or so before serious marriage negotiations properly begin, a pause Eleanor herself never had, married within 18 months of her own debut, a fact she thinks about sometimes, with something that is not quite regret, but sits somewhere in its general neighborhood. Health and medicine occupied their own particular place in this world too, worth a few minutes of attention, because the assumptions involved were considerably different from anything a modern listener would recognize. Wealth in this era brought access to considerably better medical care than most Americans could ever hope for. The finest physicians in the city on retainer, effectively, for a family like the Whitfields, available at any hour for any concern, however minor. And yet even this access existed inside the real limits of 1893 medicine, an era still without antibiotics, still years away from a great many discoveries we now take entirely for granted, meaning that money could buy comfort and attention and the very best available treatment, but could not yet buy the kind of certainty a modern family assumes almost without thinking. Eleanor has learned, across 20 years in this world, to hold a particular kind of watchfulness around illness that never fully leaves her, a background awareness that no amount of marble or staff or careful planning can entirely insulate a family from, and she is, tonight, quietly and simply grateful that everyone under this roof is well, a gratitude she rarely voices aloud but feels genuinely every single evening when she checks in on her sleeping household before finally allowing herself to rest. There is a particular ritual connected to health that wealthy families of this era practiced with real seriousness, worth mentioning because it produced some genuinely lovely architecture that still exists today in various forms. Spa towns, both in America and across Europe, built entire economies around wealthy families traveling to take the waters, a practice with roots in genuine, if somewhat overstated, medical belief about the restorative properties of specific mineral springs, and which functioned in practice as much as a social occasion as a medical one. Entire seasons of fashionable society decamping temporarily to particular springs where the same faces from New York and Newport reassembled in slightly different, more relaxed configuration. Eleanor and Charles spent 3 weeks at one such spa the summer after Henry was born, a trip she remembers now with genuine warmth, less for any medical benefit than for the simple, rare pleasure of several weeks with considerably less social obligation than either Fifth Avenue or Newport ever allowed, long, slow mornings and quiet afternoons that felt at the time almost like a glimpse of some entirely different, gentler life she might have lived, had circumstances arranged themselves differently. Let me take you forward briefly, just for a few minutes, to a night that has not happened yet on the calendar we have been following tonight, because I think it helps to understand where all of this evening's careful preparation is actually heading. It is January now, in this small imagined forward glance, and the ballroom on the second floor, closed and dust-sheeted every other night of the year, stands fully lit for the first time in months, chandeliers unwrapped and blazing with the same steady electric light that so amazed Eleanor when it first arrived in this house. Several hundred guests moving through rooms that spent the entire preceding autumn simply waiting for exactly this evening. Marian stands at the top of the grand staircase in white, the traditional color, her gown considerably simpler in design than her mother's evening dresses, deliberately so, because a debutante's dress was meant to suggest freshness and promise, rather than the fuller, more established display appropriate to a married woman, and she waits there for a long, suspended moment before her formal entrance is announced, the entire room turning toward the staircase at once, several hundred pairs of eyes taking in a single collective glance, the young woman this entire season has been quietly, carefully building toward. Eleanor watches from partway down the staircase, positioned specifically so she can see her daughter's face rather than merely the room's reaction to her, and feels in that particular suspended moment something that cuts straight through 20 years of careful, practiced composure, an unguarded rush of feeling she does not entirely try to suppress. Pride, without question, but something more complicated too, a recognition that this exact moment, however celebrated, however beautifully staged, also marks the precise instant her daughter stops being fully a child and becomes, formally and publicly, a piece on the board of this particular social game, a transition Eleanor experienced herself once, a lifetime ago it now seems, and has never quite finished making peace with, even now, even standing here watching it happen to someone she loves more than she has ever managed to say adequately in words. The ball itself, when it finally happens, will run past 3 in the morning, will include an orchestra brought in specifically for the occasion, will require flowers ordered months in advance, and a supper served at midnight, nearly as elaborate as tonight's dinner, will cost, in total, a sum that Eleanor genuinely does not know precisely, because Charles handles that particular number and has, quietly, decided not to burden her with it, understanding correctly that the actual figure, however comfortably affordable, would sit uneasily with her if she thought about it too directly. This is one small mercy husbands in this world occasionally extended their wives, a careful management of exactly which numbers needed to be known and which were, kindly, better left unspoken, even between two people who otherwise shared nearly everything. But that night is still months away tonight, still unwritten, still only a shape Eleanor is building toward one careful call and one careful letter and one careful dinner party at a time, and I think it is worth returning now, gently, to where we actually are, which is this quiet, dim bedroom, well past 1 in the morning, on an ordinary autumn night that felt, to everyone at tonight's table, entirely extraordinary, and will, within a few days, simply become one more successful evening, folded into the long accumulating record of a life built almost entirely from evenings exactly like it. Let us settle back into the actual hour now, into this house, into this particular quiet. Eleanor's breathing has already begun to slow. The last of the staff finished their work some while ago and have gone up themselves to rooms considerably smaller and plainer than this one, where they will sleep for perhaps 5 hours before the entire enormous machine of this household begins turning again. Somewhere on the floor below, Whitmore makes his final round of the ground floor, checking locks and windows out of a habit so old he could perform it in complete darkness without thinking, which, most nights, is more or less exactly what he does. The coal in the kitchen stove glows low and orange in the dark. The tea service sits on the sideboard in the breakfast room, waiting for morning, waiting to be used again the way it has been used every morning for 3 generations now, carrying its own small history quietly forward into whatever comes next. There is a term that emerged from an economist writing only a few years after tonight's dinner party, a phrase that has outlived almost everyone who might have attended an evening exactly like this one, and I think it belongs somewhere in tonight's story, because it names something we have been circling all evening without quite putting a word to it. Conspicuous consumption, the economist called it, the deliberate, visible spending of wealth specifically for the purpose of displaying that wealth to others, spending whose primary function was not comfort or genuine enjoyment, but demonstration, proof, a kind of continuous public argument about status, conducted entirely through gowns and dinners and marble staircases. The phrase caught on almost immediately, in part because everyone who read it, including people who lived lives exactly like Eleanor's, recognized something uncomfortably accurate in it, a mirror held up to an entire social world that had, until that point, mostly preferred not to examine its own reflection too closely. I do not think Eleanor would entirely disagree with the term if she encountered it, though she would probably find it a little unkind, a little too clinical for a life that, from the inside, felt considerably more textured and complicated than a simple economic label could capture. Yes, the dinner tonight displayed wealth. Yes, the gown, the necklace, the 9 courses, the imported wine, all of it existed partly, even largely, to communicate a message about the Whitfields' position in a hierarchy everyone at that table understood without needing it explained. But the evening also contained real affection, real music, real careful kindness extended to a nervous younger guest, a real small thaw between 2 women who have spent 6 months in quiet tension. Display and genuine feeling occupied the same rooms tonight, often the same moments, and I think any honest account of this era has to hold both truths at once rather than collapsing everything into either pure performance or pure sincerity. The house itself contains a handful of small technological marvels worth mentioning before we let the evening finally close, because they tell you something about exactly how new, how genuinely startling, certain now ordinary conveniences still felt in 1893. beyond the electric lighting we have already discussed, the house includes one of the earliest private elevators installed in a New York residence, a small, elegant cage of a thing tucked discreetly near the main staircase, used mostly by Eleanor's mother-in-law during her final years when the stairs had grown difficult for her, and occasionally, secretly, by Marian and Henry as children, who considered it the single most exciting feature of the entire house, and would ride it up and down for the sheer delight of it until a governess inevitably discovered them and put a stop to it. There is also in the kitchen one of the newer mechanical ice boxes supplied regularly by an ice delivery service that harvests actual ice from frozen lakes upstate each winter and stores it in enormous insulated warehouses through the summer months, a system that strikes a modern listener as almost absurdly laborious and struck this household in 1893 as the very height of modern convenience. I find myself genuinely charmed, honestly, by the idea of two small children sneaking rides in a private elevator purely for the thrill of it, mechanical novelty and childhood delight intersecting in exactly the way they always have, regardless of century, regardless of how much marble surrounds them. Some things, it turns out, do not change nearly as much as the rest of this story might suggest. Children still love a good elevator. A tired woman still treasures a necklace for reasons that have nothing to do with its value. A sister still writes to a sister in a private language built from years of shared history. Underneath the fortune, underneath the marble and the imported silk and the 9 courses, there is simply a family, living a life, worrying about their children and their marriages and their own small private griefs and joys, in a house considerably larger and considerably stranger than most, but not, underneath it, quite as different from any other family's ordinary evening as all that splendor might first suggest. Let me tell you about an ordinary week in Eleanor's life, rather than simply this one especially eventful day, because I think it helps to understand that tonight, for all its scale, was not actually unusual so much as it was simply this particular Tuesday's version of a pattern that repeated, in slightly varied form, almost every single week of the social season. Mondays typically brought committee meetings, Eleanor sitting on 3 separate charitable boards this particular season, one focused on a hospital, one on an orphan asylum, and one on a fund providing winter coal to needy families in the tenement districts a few miles south of her own front door. Meetings conducted with the same careful procedural formality as any modern corporate board. Minutes kept, motions made and seconded, considerable sums of money allocated with real seriousness and real, if sometimes limited, effect. Tuesdays, like tonight, tended toward the largest entertaining of the week. Wednesdays were reserved, by long habit, for a slightly quieter rhythm. Morning calls in the early afternoon, but no large dinner. An evening sometimes spent simply at home with Charles and whichever of the children happened to be present. A small, treasured pocket of ordinary domestic quiet inside an otherwise relentlessly scheduled week. Thursdays brought the opera, when it was in season, Eleanor and Charles in their carefully cultivated box, seeing and being seen by roughly the same several hundred people who attended every single Thursday performance. The music itself, Eleanor has admitted to herself privately, though never aloud, sometimes almost secondary to the ritual of simply being present. Fridays and the weekend brought their own smaller variations, occasionally a trip out of the city, occasionally simply more of the same careful social maintenance that filled nearly every other day. The sheer financial scale of maintaining this rhythm, week after week, season after season, is worth sitting with for a moment, in terms that might actually mean something rather than simply an abstract enormous number. The household's total annual expenditure this year, staff wages, food, entertaining, wardrobe, maintenance of 2 full residences and a farm, runs to a sum that would, by conservative period estimate, support somewhere between 200 and 300 working-class families for an entire year, each of those families living on wages earned through genuinely hard physical labor that most of tonight's dinner guests would never once in their lives be required to perform. I mention this number not to interrupt the warmth of this evening with a harsh judgment, but because I think an honest telling of this era has to include it somewhere, has to let the actual scale of the disparity sit quietly alongside the marble and the candlelight, the way both things genuinely coexisted every single day, only a short carriage ride apart from each other. Charles has his own quieter rhythms too, worth a brief mention before we finally let this house rest. Sunday mornings, specifically, belong to him in a way almost nothing else in his week does, a standing habit maintained across the entire 20 years of his marriage, rising early before even the household staff has fully begun its own day, and walking alone through the still mostly empty streets near the house, no destination in particular, simply walking, the one unstructured hour in his entire week that belongs to absolutely nobody's expectations but his own. He started this habit, he once told Eleanor, back when the fortune was still new and considerably smaller and the responsibility of it still felt, some mornings, like something closer to fear than triumph, and he found that walking, simply moving through a quiet city before it woke, settled something in him that nothing else quite managed to. He still does it now, 20 years and a great deal more money later, not because he needs the same reassurance anymore, but because the habit itself has become, in its own way, one of the few genuinely private rooms in his own otherwise thoroughly managed life, not so different in its function if not its form from Eleanor's folded letters to her sister. Let me tell you about Eleanor's wardrobe as a whole, not simply tonight's gown, because the scale of it, considered properly, says something genuinely striking about how much of this world's economy ran directly through women's clothing specifically. A woman of Eleanor's position required, across a single social season, dozens of distinct outfits, each suited to a specific occasion and a specific time of day. Morning dresses considered entirely unsuitable for afternoon wear, afternoon dresses that could never appear at an evening event, separate categories again for calling, for travel, for mourning should the need arise, for each distinct sporting activity fashionable that particular year. Her closets, and there are several throughout her dressing rooms, hold, at any given moment during the season, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 100 separate garments in active rotation, not counting shoes, gloves, hats, and the enormous supporting infrastructure of underlayers required to make any of it function correctly. This was not considered excessive within her circle. It was, if anything, considered the bare functional minimum for a woman required to appear correctly dressed for several distinct occasions nearly every single day. An entire industry of dressmakers and milliners and glove makers and jewelers, sustained almost entirely by the requirements of perhaps a few hundred women across the entire country, living lives structurally similar to Eleanor's. I find it worth noting, gently, how much labor, how many skilled hands, sat behind every single one of those garments. Seamstresses and embroiderers and lace makers whose own names history recorded even less faithfully than it recorded Sarah's, working long hours in conditions considerably harder than anything Eleanor herself ever experienced, to produce clothing that a woman like Eleanor might wear once or twice before setting it aside for something newer. There is a smaller, gentler memory connected to clothing that Eleanor returns to sometimes, and I want to share it before we move toward closing, because it is one of the few threads in tonight's story that has nothing to do with performance at all. When Marian was small, perhaps 4 or 5, she used to sneak into Eleanor's dressing room during the quiet hour before dinner, when Eleanor was already dressed and simply waiting, and would sit on the floor beside her mother's chair, playing with the hem of whatever gown Eleanor happened to be wearing that evening, running the fabric between small fingers, asking, with the particular relentless curiosity of a young child, why this dress and not another? Why this color? Why tonight and not some other night? Eleanor answered these questions patiently, more patiently than she answered almost anything else in her day, because there was something in that particular quiet hour, her small daughter on the floor beside her, that felt entirely free of the calculations governing nearly everything else in her life. Marian does not remember this specific ritual anymore, or claims not to, though Eleanor sometimes wonders whether some quieter version of the memory survives in her daughter somewhere, folded away the way early memories often are, present even when they cannot be consciously recalled. The nursery itself, on the 3rd floor, sits mostly unused now, Henry and Marian long grown past the age it was built for, though Eleanor still walks through it occasionally, on quiet afternoons when nobody else is home, running a hand along a small wooden rocking horse neither child has touched in over a decade, a set of shelved picture books whose spines she could probably still recite from memory if she tried. There is a particular kind of ache connected to rooms like this one, rooms built for a version of your family that no longer exists, replaced by the taller, more independent, more complicated people your children have since become, and Eleanor feels it more than she lets herself examine directly, tucking it away the same way she tucks away most of her sharper feelings, filed carefully alongside the letter to Catherine and the small private grief of watching Marion step, however gracefully, into the exact same constrained world Eleanor herself has spent 20 years quietly, privately negotiating. There is a tradition connected to Thanksgiving worth mentioning, only a few weeks away now, on the calendar we have been following tonight, because it shows a slightly different face of this family than the one we have mostly seen this evening. Eleanor's charitable committee, the one focused on winter coal for tenement families, expands its work every November into an organized distribution of Thanksgiving baskets, an effort Eleanor has personally overseen for nearly a decade now, and which involves, unusually for her, actual physical presence in neighborhoods she otherwise experiences only through committee reports and second-hand description. She rides down personally once a year on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving to help oversee the final distribution, standing for several hours in a church hall, a considerable social and physical distance from her own dining room, handing baskets directly into the hands of women whose lives resemble nothing at all like her own, and finding, every single year, that this particular afternoon leaves her quieter and more thoughtful than almost anything else her charitable work involves. She has never fully articulated, even to herself, exactly why this one afternoon affects her the way it does, when so much of her other charitable involvement remains comfortably abstract, numbers and committee votes rather than actual faces. Perhaps it is simply the directness of it, the rare experience, in an otherwise thoroughly mediated life, of a genuine unmanaged exchange with another woman, mother to mother, across a gap of circumstance so wide it should make real connection impossible, and somehow, for a few minutes each year, does not entirely. Charles has offered, more than once, to have the entire distribution simply funded more generously and conducted by staff, sparing Eleanor the trip entirely, and Eleanor has refused every single time in a tone that closes the conversation the same way her tone closed the question about the necklace, a small, firm insistence on doing this one particular thing herself, for reasons she has never fully explained, and Charles wisely has stopped asking her to. Newport carries its own set of curious traditions worth a brief mention too, because summer there operates on a rhythm considerably different from the winter season we have spent most of tonight inside. Yacht racing occupies a genuinely significant place in the Newport calendar, an entire fleet of enormous, extravagantly expensive racing yachts owned by families exactly like the Whitfields, competing across a summer's worth of regattas watched from the shore by the same social circle that fills the ballrooms each evening. Charles keeps a yacht himself, considerably smaller than the largest in the fleet but respectable, and Henry has, this past summer, taken over much of the actual sailing of it, a rare arena where father and son find themselves working together as genuine equals rather than in the more complicated dynamic that governs their relationship to Charles's business. There is something Eleanor treasures about watching the two of them from the shore during a race, the particular ease between them out on the water that seems to evaporate the moment they step back onto land and into the more formal expectations waiting there. The lawns of Newport, sweeping down from each cottage toward the cliffs and the ocean beyond, host their own particular summer rituals too, garden parties and croquet and, increasingly this past decade, the newer game of lawn tennis, which Marion has taken to with real, unperformed enthusiasm, one of the few physical activities considered entirely appropriate for a young woman of her position, and one she genuinely loves, rather than merely tolerates for its social value. Eleanor watches her daughter play sometimes from the shade of the veranda, racket in hand, laughing in a way that carries none of the careful calibration required at a dinner table, and thinks, in these unguarded summer moments, that perhaps her daughter's life will contain more genuine ease than Eleanor sometimes fears for her, small pockets of real unmanaged pleasure carved out here and there within the larger structure neither of them will ever fully escape. Let me return for a few minutes to the world below stairs, because we have mentioned it in passing several times tonight without ever quite stepping fully inside it, and I think a full picture of this house requires at least a brief visit there before we close. The servants' hall, in the basement, functions as its own small society, complete with its own hierarchy, its own rivalries, its own quiet friendships, almost a miniature reflection of the world upstairs, though built from entirely different material. Whitmore, as butler, presides over meals taken there with an authority nearly as absolute as Charles exercises upstairs, seated at the head of a long table where footmen and housemaids and kitchen staff eat together after the family's own meals are finished. A strict order of precedence observed even here, senior staff seated nearer the head of the table, junior staff further down. The whole arrangement, a quiet echo of the seating charts Eleanor spends hours constructing for her own dinner parties. Sarah, the young housemaid we met at the very start of tonight's story, has worked in this house for just over 2 years now, having come to New York from a farm in upstate New York, with very little beyond a letter of recommendation from her previous employer and a genuine determination to do well in a position that pays considerably better and offers considerably more security than almost anything available to her back home. She sends a portion of her wages home each month to a mother managing a smaller household on far more limited means, a small quiet act of care that, though nobody in this story has drawn the comparison directly, sits remarkably close in spirit to the letter Eleanor sealed and sent to her own sister this same morning. 2 women, occupying entirely different floors of the same house and entirely different tiers of the same society, both quietly, privately supporting family members outside the walls of this house, in gestures neither woman is likely ever to discuss with the other, separated as they are by a gap in circumstance that this era made almost impossible to bridge in any ordinary social sense. I think that parallel is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, because it suggests something true underneath all the very real differences we have spent tonight examining. The specific shape of a life changes enormously depending on which floor of the house you occupy, whether you sleep in a room with silk wallpaper or a narrow shared room on the topmost floor, whether your wardrobe holds 80 gowns or 2 serviceable uniforms. But certain underlying instincts, it turns out, do not change nearly as much. The instinct to care quietly for people outside your own household, to fold a small act of love into an ordinary Tuesday without any expectation of it being seen or praised, exists on every floor of this house tonight, expressed through whatever material each woman happens to have available to her. Sarah has, this particular evening, spent the hours of the dinner party helping in ways considerably less visible than the footmen serving upstairs, carrying trays between kitchen and dining room through the hidden back passages built specifically for this purpose, keeping the fires fed in rooms the guests pass through but never really noticed, the countless small invisible tasks that allow an evening like tonight's to appear, from the guest's perspective, almost effortless. She will be tired tomorrow, genuinely tired, in a way none of tonight's 30 guests will be, and she will still rise before dawn regardless, because the household's morning routine depends on her being awake and ready considerably before Eleanor herself opens her eyes, the same quiet, unacknowledged foundation that made this entire glittering evening possible in the first place, and will make tomorrow morning's ordinary breakfast possible too, table legs polished once more, whether anyone upstairs ever thinks to notice or not. There is one more small thread I want to give you before we finally let this house rest, because it belongs to Marian, and I think it deserves its own quiet space rather than being folded entirely into her mother's story. Marian paints, or rather, she paints in secret, in the same quiet, private way her mother writes letters to Catherine, a habit she picked up from a governess several years ago and has continued largely alone since, working in watercolour on evenings when nobody expects anything else of her. Small studies of the garden at Newport, of the light through her bedroom window in winter, of Henry asleep in a chair with a book fallen open on his chest one lazy August afternoon. She has never shown these to anyone outside her governess, and never to her mother, not out of any particular fear exactly, more out of an instinct that this particular pleasure belongs entirely to her, untouched by the careful evaluating eye that examines nearly everything else about her, her posture, her conversation, her prospects, her wardrobe. There is a version of Marian's future, one she allows herself to imagine only very rarely and only very privately, in which painting becomes something more than an evening habit, in which she studies properly, perhaps even exhibits, the way a small handful of women of her class occasionally manage to do, usually after marriage rather than before, once a husband's indulgence made such things possible. She does not know yet whether her own marriage, whoever it eventually is arranged with, will allow for that kind of indulgence, Whether she will find in her own husband something like the quiet, genuine respect Charles extends to Eleanor's occasional private interests, or whether the paintings will simply remain what they are now, a folded, private pleasure kept in a drawer, taken out only when nobody else is home. She thinks about this more than her parents realize, lying awake sometimes in the same late hour her mother lies awake downstairs. The two of them, mother and daughter, separated by 1 floor and 20 years, each holding their own quiet private hope folded carefully away from a world that has taught both of them, thoroughly and from a very young age, exactly which parts of themselves are safe to show and which are better kept entirely to themselves. I think this is, in its own way, the truest emotional current running underneath this entire evening, underneath the marble and the 9 courses and the careful diplomacy of the drawing room. Every single person in this house tonight, upstairs and down, family and staff alike, carry some private room inside themselves that the visible architecture of their life does not fully account for. Eleanor's letters, Charles's unnamed hospital ward and his solitary Sunday walks, Marian's watercolours, Sarah's wages sent home each month to a mother she misses more than she generally lets herself admit. Even Henry, for all his easy, unexamined confidence, carries his own quiet uncertainty about whether the future being built for him, his father's business, his father's world, is actually the future he would choose for himself if anyone had ever thought to ask him directly, which, in this particular family, in this particular era, nobody generally does. None of these private rooms will likely ever be fully seen by anyone else in this house. Not completely, not in the way each person perhaps quietly wishes they could be. That is, I think, simply part of what it meant to live inside a world this carefully performed, this thoroughly managed from the earliest hours of the morning until the last quiet minutes before sleep. But the rooms exist anyway, tucked into the architecture of each private life, the way the servants' back stairs are tucked into the architecture of the house itself, a second, hidden structure running parallel to the visible one, carrying its own weight, its own history, its own quiet, ongoing life that the marble and the gold leaf were never actually built to show you. Eleanor's own mother taught her most of what she knows about running a house like this one, though the teaching happened gradually, almost invisibly, across an entire childhood, rather than through any single formal lesson, the way most of the truly essential knowledge in this world passed from mother to daughter. She remembers watching her mother receive morning calls when Eleanor was still a child young enough to be allowed to sit quietly in the corner of the drawing room, absorbing, without fully realizing she was absorbing anything, the particular rhythm of that world, when to speak and when to simply listen, how to hold a teacup correctly, how to steer a conversation without ever seeming to steer it at all. Her mother's household, while genuinely comfortable, never approached the scale Eleanor now manages herself. And there is a version of Eleanor, quiet and rarely voiced, that still sometimes feels slightly like a child playing at a game considerably larger than the one she was actually raised to play, a feeling she suspects, though she has never asked directly, that most women in her position privately share, however completely they have mastered the outward performance of total ease. Her mother died 6 years ago now, quietly, at home, surrounded by the family she raised, and Eleanor still finds herself, more often than she expects, wanting to ask her something, some small practical question about a seating arrangement or a delicate social situation that her mother would have known instantly how to handle. The particular ache of losing not just a parent, but an entire accumulated body of specific, irreplaceable knowledge that no book or etiquette manual ever fully captured. She thinks of her mother tonight, actually, lying here in the dark, remembering a specific evening from her own childhood, her mother in evening dress pausing at the nursery door on her way down to a dinner party very much like tonight's, leaning in to kiss Eleanor and her sister goodnight, the particular scent of her mother's perfume, something floral and slightly old-fashioned even by the standards of that earlier decade, a scent Eleanor has never quite been able to identify or replicate since, though she has tried, more than once, standing in perfume shops in Paris, hoping some bottle might unlock the memory more completely. This is, I think, one of the quieter truths worth carrying out of tonight's story. Underneath everything else we have covered, the marble and the money and the careful social maneuvering, however large the house, however extraordinary the wealth, the actual emotional material of this family's life, love between mother and daughter, the particular ache of losing a parent, the private hope a young woman holds for her own future, the quiet loyalty between sisters separated by circumstance, remains recognizably ordinarily human, built from the same basic elements that would furnish any family's story, wealthy or otherwise. The scale changes, the stakes in some sense change, but the underlying shape of what it means to love people and worry about them and want good things for them and sometimes fail to say the truest things directly, that shape stays remarkably constant, whether you are falling asleep tonight in a room with silk wallpaper or in a narrow bed 3 floors above it, whether your worries concern a debut ball or simply making it safely through another ordinary week. There is one more evening worth telling you about before we finally let this house rest, an evening from several years back rather than tonight itself, because it explains a great deal about how thoroughly competitive this world could become when a hostess truly decided to reach for something extraordinary. A family somewhat further up the social ladder than the Whitfields, old money layered over new money in a combination that made them, for a period of years, close to unassailable, hosted a costume ball that society columns were still referencing years afterward, an evening so lavish that Eleanor, who attended as a considerably younger woman, still describes it, when the subject comes up, as the single most extraordinary night she has ever witnessed inside a private home. The hostess had transformed her entire ground floor into a recreation of a French royal court, hired an actual small orchestra to play continuously from a balcony built temporarily into the ballroom for the occasion, and required every guest to arrive in costume representing a specific historical or mythological figure. No exceptions, a demand so absolute that several families reportedly spent more preparing their costumes for that single evening than most working households spent in a year on clothing altogether. Eleanor, still newly married at the time, went as a figure from classical mythology, her costume designed months in advance by the same dressmaker who now serves her daughter, and she remembers, even now, the particular vertigo of walking into that ballroom and understanding, immediately and completely, that she was witnessing something calibrated specifically to establish, once and for all, exactly whose house stood at the true center of this entire social world. The ball worked exactly as intended. Within a season, families who had previously hesitated over invitations to that household found themselves competing for them instead, and the hostess who threw it maintained a kind of quiet, unchallenged authority over the city's social calendar for years afterward, an authority built, in the end, on a single spectacular evening that cost more than most of the guests in attendance would openly admit to knowing the figure of. Eleanor has never attempted anything on quite that scale herself, and privately doubts she ever will, partly from temperament and partly from a calculation she has never fully spoken aloud even to Charles, a sense that reaching for that level of spectacle risks more than it gains, invites scrutiny and envy in roughly equal measure to admiration, and Eleanor has always preferred steady, careful accumulation of social standing over the more dramatic, more visible gamble that a single extraordinary evening represents. It is, in its own way, the same instinct that shaped Charles's approach to building his fortune in the first place, patience over spectacle, though neither of them has ever put the parallel into words between them. Let me tell you something about the old money and new money divide in slightly more depth, because we have touched on it several times tonight without ever quite walking all the way through its actual mechanics, and I think the specifics are genuinely worth knowing. Old families, the ones whose wealth traced back generations before the war, before the rail lines and the steel mills that built fortunes like Charles's, maintained their social position through a set of unwritten rules so deeply internalized that most of them would have struggled to articulate the rules directly if asked. Never discuss money. Never display wealth in a manner that could be described as showing off, a distinction that grew considerably more difficult to maintain as new money families built houses and threw parties that made restraint increasingly difficult to sustain by comparison. Never marry beneath your tier without very good reason, and even then expect years of quiet, polite skepticism before full acceptance arrived, if it arrived at all. New money families, by contrast, generally understood, correctly, that waiting patiently for organic acceptance could take a generation or longer, time many of them did not particularly wish to spend simply waiting. So they built instead houses larger than the old families, collections more extensive, entertainments more lavish, betting, often successfully, that sufficient scale and sufficient persistence would eventually force a kind of acceptance that patience alone might never produce. Both strategies worked, in different measures, for different families, and the actual social landscape Eleanor moves through today represents decades of exactly this quiet, ongoing negotiation between two different theories of how legitimacy gets built, one resting on time and restraint, the other on scale and sheer persistent visibility. Eleanor herself, straddling both worlds through her own family's older name and her husband's newer fortune, has spent 20 years learning to speak both languages fluently, switching between them so smoothly that most people who know her socially would struggle to say which side of that old divide she actually belongs to, which is, in the end, precisely the point. The city itself changes character as the season moves deeper into winter, and I want to give you a few minutes of that before we close, because the physical texture of New York in this particular era deserves its own attention. By December, the avenue outside the Whitfield house will be genuinely cold, snow gathering along the curbs in grey drifts that the household's own staff help clear from the front steps each morning. Though the deeper business of snow removal across the city remains, at this point in history, considerably less organized than a modern resident would expect. Streets sometimes impassable for days after a heavy fall, carriages navigating around drifts that would simply be ploughed away within hours in a later century. The gas lamps take on a particular quality in winter dusk that Eleanor has always found beautiful, a soft amber haze settling over the street by 4 in the afternoon as the short winter daylight fades, windows all along the avenue beginning to glow with lamplight, and in houses like the Whitfields, the newer, steadier electric light that still, even now, strikes passers-by on the street below as something faintly magical. Winter also brings its own particular illnesses through the household, colds and the occasional more serious fever moving through staff and family alike in the colder months, and Eleanor manages these small crises with the same brisk, capable attention she brings to everything else. A pot of broth sent up personally to a housemaid laid low with fever, a doctor summoned without hesitation the moment any family member shows symptoms serious enough to warrant one, the genuine unperformed care she extends toward the people under her roof, whatever their position in the household's hierarchy, existing quietly alongside the more calculated social management that governs so much of her daylight hours. I think this detail matters because it would be easy, telling a story this focused on performance and strategy, to make Eleanor sound colder than she actually is. She is not cold. She is careful and calculating in the specific ways her world demanded of her, but the genuine warmth underneath all that careful calculation is real too, expressed in 100 small daily gestures that never once made it into any society column. Let me take you back into Charles's world for a while longer, because there is a specific story from earlier in his career that Eleanor thinks about more than she lets on, and which explains a great deal about the particular caution he still carries into every negotiation, even now, 20 years and an enormous fortune later. Early in his career, not long after he first began expanding beyond his father's original foundry, Charles entered into a partnership with another young businessman, a man of considerable charm and, as it eventually turned out, considerably less integrity than the arrangement required. The partnership involved a joint investment in rail infrastructure that promised, on paper, extraordinary returns, and Charles, still young enough to trust more readily than he does now, committed a significant portion of his early capital to it. The partnership collapsed within 2 years, not through bad luck exactly, but through what Charles eventually discovered was a deliberate pattern of misrepresentation on his partner's side. Inflated figures, hidden liabilities, a version of the business considerably rosier on paper than it ever was in practice. Charles lost in that collapse nearly everything he had built up to that point, a genuine, serious setback that very nearly ended his career before it properly began, and which he has never discussed in detail with anyone outside his own closest circle, and never with Henry, who knows only the vaguest outline of the story and has never pressed his father for more. Eleanor knows the fuller version, told to her once, quietly, early in their marriage, in one of the few conversations across 20 years where she watched her husband's careful composure slip entirely, if only for the length of that single evening. Charles rebuilt from that collapse slowly and with a caution that has never fully left him, and it explains, more than almost anything else about his character, the particular patience that eventually became his signature in business, the willingness to wait years for an advantage rather than reach for one prematurely, the instinct to verify everything twice before committing capital to anything at all. It also explains something quieter, a specific watchfulness he carries into every new business relationship, a slight, almost imperceptible reserve that colleagues sometimes mistake for coldness and that Eleanor understands, correctly, as the lingering shape of an old wound that never entirely closed. I find myself genuinely moved by this, honestly, the idea that underneath the confident, successful man who negotiates rail agreements in private clubs and funds hospital wards under an assumed anonymity, there remains a younger man who trusted the wrong person once, badly, and has spent every year since quietly making sure it never happens again. There is a kind of justice in how thoroughly Charles eventually surpassed the man who nearly ruined him, though Charles himself has never framed it that way, never spoken of revenge or vindication, only ever of caution and careful verification. The former partner's own business, built on the same pattern of overstatement that damaged Charles so badly, eventually collapsed entirely under its own weight several years later, the man himself fading from the city's business circles into a kind of quiet, diminished irrelevance that Charles has never once gloated over, at least not aloud, though Eleanor has occasionally caught something in her husband's expression at the mention of the man's name in passing conversation that suggests the old wound, however healed, has not been entirely forgotten either. Let me offer you one more thread about the household's finances, one that Eleanor herself only partially understands, because Charles keeps the full architecture of it largely to himself, in the way many men of his position did. The fortune itself is not held simply as a single lump of accumulated cash, but spread deliberately across a range of holdings, rail stock, steel interests, real estate scattered through several cities, a portfolio structured specifically to survive exactly the kind of collapse Charles experienced once already and has spent every year since guarding against happening again. He reviews this structure personally, at length, several times a year, closeted alone in his study with ledgers that even his most trusted business associates never see in full, a private discipline that Eleanor recognizes, though she would never say so aloud, as its own version of the folded letters she sends to Catherine, a quiet, solitary act of care conducted entirely outside anyone else's view, tending to something that matters enormously and receives, from the household at large, almost no visible attention at all. The children, for their part, understand almost nothing of this particular architecture, and Charles has deliberately kept it that way, believing, with a conviction shaped directly by his own early setback, that a young person handed full knowledge of an enormous fortune before they have developed the judgment to manage it wisely is being set up for exactly the kind of catastrophic misstep that nearly ended his own career. Henry will learn the fuller picture gradually, over years, as Charles slowly brings him into the actual workings of the business rather than simply its social performance, a process Charles has deliberately paced slower than Henry himself would prefer, much to the quiet, occasionally voiced frustration of a 19-year-old who feels, not unreasonably, that he is more ready for real responsibility than his father currently allows him to demonstrate. I want to take you back into Delacroix's kitchen for a while, because we moved through tonight's dinner rather quickly earlier, and there is real pleasure in slowing down and considering the actual craft involved, the kind of pleasure that has nothing to do with any of the social manoeuvring we have spent so much of tonight examining. Delacroix trained in Paris under a chef whose own reputation still carries weight in certain culinary circles, and he brought with him to New York not just recipes, but an entire philosophy of cooking, built around patience, around stocks, simmered for the better part of a day before they ever become the foundation for something else, around sauces reduced slowly, watched constantly, adjusted by fractions of a degree in seasoning that only a trained palate could distinguish at all. The consommé that opened tonight's dinner took nearly 2 full days to prepare properly, beginning with a stock built from bones roasted first to deepen their flavor, simmered gently for hours with vegetables and herbs, then clarified through an elaborate process involving egg whites that draws every trace of cloudiness out of the liquid, leaving behind something perfectly clear, perfectly golden, a soup that looks, when it finally reaches the table, almost too simple to have required any effort at all, which is, of course, precisely the intended effect. Delacroix has always found something quietly satisfying in that particular deception. The idea that the most labor-intensive dishes on his menu are often the ones that appear, to the diner, the most effortless, while a dish that actually took considerably less work might arrive at the table dressed in visible, showy garnish, specifically because it needs the help. The kitchen itself operates on a rhythm entirely its own, considerably more physically demanding than almost any other part of the household's daily operation. A staff of 6 working under Delacroix across a stretch of hours that begins well before dawn and, on a night like tonight, extends past midnight before the last pot is finally scrubbed and hung. There is a hierarchy here too, as rigid in its own way as the one governing the front of the house. A sous chef answering directly to Delacroix, beneath him a pastry cook responsible specifically for the elaborate dessert work that so delighted tonight's guests. Beneath her again a kitchen maid, whose days are spent almost entirely on the least glamorous work imaginable, scrubbing vegetables, tending the coal-fired range, hauling water, the unglamorous physical foundation that makes everything above her possible. Delacroix's own story is worth a moment too, because it illustrates something true about how thoroughly this entire world ran on imported European expertise, purchased at considerable expense, and treated, once secured, as one of a household's most prized possessions. His salary, negotiated personally by Charles when he was first hired away from a competing household 6 years ago, exceeds what many mid-level professionals in the city earn in an entire year, a figure that would genuinely astonish most of tonight's dinner guests if they ever paused to consider it, which they generally do not, in the same way they rarely consider the specific mechanics of anything that arrives at their table already finished, already perfect, already stripped of every trace of the labor that produced it. There is a particular pastry Delacroix makes only rarely, reserved for the most significant occasions of the year, rather than an ordinary dinner party like tonight's. A specific kind of elaborate spun sugar and almond confection he learnt from his own teacher in Paris, and has never fully taught to anyone on his current staff. A small deliberate withholding that Eleanor suspects, though has never confirmed directly, functions as its own quiet insurance against ever being easily replaced. Every skilled person in this household, in fact, from Whitmore down through the kitchen, seems to keep some small piece of specialized knowledge close, some particular expertise that makes them individually difficult to substitute, a survival instinct born of a world where positions this desirable, however well compensated, could still be lost, and where a person's actual security rested less on any formal contract and more on simply remaining, quietly and continuously, indispensable. There is a small garden behind the house, easy to overlook entirely if you are only picturing the grand front facade facing the avenue, and I want to give it a few minutes tonight because Eleanor loves it more than almost any other room or space in the entire property, grand or otherwise. It is not large, tucked between the rear of the house and the stable building that houses the family's carriages and horses, but it has been planted and tended with real care across the 2 decades of Eleanor's marriage. Roses along one wall that a dedicated gardener maintains with an attention nearly as exacting as anything Madame Rousseau brings to a gown. A small fountain at the centre that Eleanor selected herself on one of the early European trips, specifically because its particular sound, water moving gently rather than rushing, reminded her of a garden from her own childhood that no longer exists in the form she remembers it. She comes out here more often than most people in her circle would guess, sometimes early in the morning before the household's day has properly begun, sometimes in the late afternoon during the rare stretch when no calls are scheduled, sitting on a small stone bench beneath the roses with a book she rarely finishes reading because the garden itself, the sound of the fountain, the particular quality of light filtering through the wall that separates this small private world from the noise of the avenue beyond, tends to draw her attention away from the page and into something closer to simple, unstructured stillness. This is, I think, one of the truest private rooms in Eleanor's entire life. Not metaphorical this time, but an actual physical space, small and unglamorous by the standards of everything else surrounding it, and treasured precisely because of how little it asks of her. Marian and Henry both spent a considerable portion of their early childhood in this same garden, and Eleanor finds herself thinking about those years often when she sits out here now, a specific memory returning to her with particular clarity tonight. An ordinary summer afternoon perhaps 12 years ago, Henry no more than 7, Marian barely 5, both of them chasing something, a butterfly perhaps, or simply each other, around the small fountain while Eleanor sat exactly where she sits now, considerably younger herself, watching them with an attention that had nothing performed about it at all, no committee to manage, no guest list to finalize. Simply a mother watching her children be entirely, uncomplicatedly happy in a garden built, in part, to give them exactly that. She remembers Henry falling that same afternoon, scraping his knee badly enough to cry, and remembers scooping him up onto her lap right there on the stone bench, his small body warm and slightly sticky with the particular mess of a summer afternoon, remembers the specific way his crying slowed and then stopped as she held him, remembers Marian climbing up beside them both a moment later, wanting to be held too though she was perfectly unhurt, simply wanting to be close, and remembers thinking, in that exact moment, with a clarity she has rarely matched since, that whatever else her life eventually asked of her, whatever performance and calculation the larger world outside this garden wall would eventually demand, this particular afternoon, these two small warm bodies pressed against her on a sun-warmed stone bench, was as purely simply good as anything she would likely ever experience. That memory sits with her tonight, in a way that surprises her slightly, given everything else this particular evening has held, the dinner party, the careful diplomacy with Augusta, the letter to Catherine, Marian's poised performance at the far end of tonight's table, all of it real, all of it consequential in its own way, and underneath all of it, still, this, a garden, a scraped knee, 2 children who no longer fit on her lap at all, who have grown into a young woman managing her own careful social performance, and a young man beginning to carry the weight of a fortune he did not build himself, but who were once, simply and entirely, hers to hold, uncomplicated by any of the machinery that now shapes almost every other hour of her day. The gardener maintains this small space year-round, even through winter when almost nothing blooms, and the fountain itself must be drained and covered against the frost, because Eleanor asked him to years ago, in one of the few direct requests she has ever made about the property that had nothing to do with how it would appear to guests, since almost no guest ever sees this particular corner of the grounds at all. It exists, quietly, entirely for her, a small deliberate exception carved out of a life otherwise built almost entirely around being seen. Let me tell you about how marriages were actually arranged inside this world, because it is more interesting and considerably more layered than the simple word arranged might suggest to a modern listener, and it connects directly to what waits ahead for Marian once her debut season concludes. This was not generally a system of parents simply selecting a husband and presenting him to their daughter as a fact already decided, at least not among families at the Whitfields' level by the 1890s, that harsher version having largely softened, in America if not always in Europe, into something closer to a carefully managed courtship, guided heavily by parents on both sides but requiring, in the end, the genuine consent and at least the appearance of genuine affection from both young people involved. The mechanics worked something like this. A mother identified, across a season or two of careful observation, a handful of young men whose families, prospects and character seemed suitable, and then, through the same web of calls and dinners and committee memberships that governs everything else in this world, engineered opportunities for her daughter to be in the same rooms as these young men, repeatedly, naturally, without either party ever feeling explicitly steered. Eleanor has already begun this process for Marian, quietly, the 2 young men seated near her daughter at tonight's dinner having been placed there through exactly this kind of careful, invisible engineering, their families both, in Eleanor's private assessment, entirely suitable, their own mothers almost surely engaged in some version of the same quiet calculation from their side of the arrangement. Once genuine mutual interest developed, and it generally needed to develop, Real affection considered increasingly important by this point in the century, even within a system still fundamentally organized around family advantage. The more explicit negotiations began, usually conducted by the fathers or, in some cases, by a trusted family lawyer acting on each side's behalf. These conversations concerned settlements, the financial arrangements that would govern the new household, and they were handled with a directness about money that stood in sharp, almost startling contrast to the strict silence around wealth that governed every other aspect of this family's life. Marriage, it turned out, was the one occasion when the unspoken rule against discussing money explicitly simply did not apply, because a marriage settlement required precision, required actual figures committed to paper, required lawyers and signatures, and a formality that no amount of polite indirection could substitute for. Eleanor's own marriage negotiation, 20 years ago now, followed exactly this pattern, and she remembers, with a clarity that still slightly surprises her, sitting in an adjoining room while her father and Charles's father discussed the settlement terms in the next room over, close enough that she could hear the general shape of the conversation without catching every specific figure, a strange liminal position to occupy. Present in the house but formally excluded from the exact conversation determining the financial architecture of her own future, she has thought, more than once across the intervening years, about whether Marian's own negotiation, whenever it eventually happens, will proceed any differently, whether the world will have shifted enough in a generation to include the bride herself more directly in conversations that will shape the rest of her material life, and has concluded, privately, that it probably will not. Not yet, not quite, though perhaps by the time Marian has a daughter of her own, something further will have changed. There is a wedding worth mentioning that took place within Eleanor's own social circle 2 years ago, because it illustrates both how these arrangements could succeed and how visibly, publicly they could also occasionally strain under pressure. A young woman Eleanor knows well, a friend of Marian's slightly older cousin, entered into a marriage that looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of successful arrangement this whole careful system was designed to produce. Families of comparable standing, a settlement generous on both sides, a courtship conducted with all the proper visible steps in all the proper visible order. And yet the marriage, within its first year, revealed itself to be considerably less happy than its careful construction had promised. The two young people fundamentally mismatched in temperament, in ways that no amount of parental calculation about family standing had thought to account for. They remain married as divorce, while not entirely unheard of even in this exact social tier, still carried a genuine social cost steep enough that most couples simply endured rather than pursued it, and Eleanor watches this particular friend sometimes, at dinners very much like tonight's, and feels a quiet, private gratitude that her own marriage, arranged through exactly this same imperfect system, happened to land somewhere considerably warmer. Charles's hospital ward, the one he funds quietly and without his name attached, deserves a fuller telling before we close tonight, because there is a specific memory connected to it that Eleanor carries more vividly than almost anything else in her husband's private philanthropy. She discovered the arrangement, as I mentioned earlier, largely by accident, overhearing a conversation between Charles and his lawyer several years ago, rather than through any confession offered directly, and her curiosity, once roused, eventually led her to visit the ward itself, unannounced, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when she happened to be nearby after a committee meeting concluded early. She remembers the ward as considerably plainer than she expected, clean and well-maintained, but without any of the marble or gilt that fills her own home. Simple iron beds arranged in careful rows, nurses moving between them with the same quiet, practiced efficiency Whitmore brings to his own duties, patients drawn largely from the immigrant neighborhoods a short distance south, people who would have had, without a ward exactly like this one, considerably less access to competent medical care than their circumstances would otherwise allow. She spoke to a nurse there, briefly, without identifying herself as anything more than a visitor, and the nurse spoke, unprompted, with genuine warmth about the anonymous benefactor whose funding had allowed the hospital to expand this particular wing 3 years earlier, a man whose identity the hospital's administration knew, but had, at his explicit and firmly repeated request, never once revealed publicly. Eleanor never told Charles she had visited, has kept this small piece of knowledge as carefully private as he has kept the ward itself, a mirror of secrecy layered on top of his own, and she thinks about this sometimes when she considers the actual architecture of their marriage, 20 years built not only on the things they share openly, the dinner conversations, the evenings at the piano, the shared worry over their children, but also on this strange, tender scaffolding of things each of them knows the other is keeping privately generous about, without either one ever quite admitting to knowing. I find something genuinely moving in that. Honestly, a marriage sustained partly through mutual, unspoken respect for the other person's right to a private goodness that asks for no acknowledgement at all. Christmas, which we touched on only briefly earlier, deserves a little more room too, because it carries its own specific texture within this household that sets it apart from almost every other occasion on the calendar. Unlike the dinner parties and balls that dominate so much of the season, Christmas in the Whitfield household remains deliberately, carefully small, a choice Eleanor made early in her marriage and has protected fiercely ever since, resisting, more than once, pressure from her own social circle to host some grander seasonal entertainment the way several comparable families do. The staff receives the day largely off, a smaller skeleton crew maintaining only the most essential functions of the household, and the family gathers instead in the smaller, less formal breakfast room rather than the grand dining room. A modest fire, simple food prepared by Delacroix, but without the elaborate multi-course architecture of a formal dinner, gifts exchanged in a manner considerably plainer than the family's overall wealth might suggest. Eleanor has never fully explained, even to herself, why this one day resists the elaborate performance that governs almost every other occasion in her calendar, though she suspects it traces back to her own childhood, to a handful of specific, treasured Christmas mornings from before her family's fortune began its own quiet decline, mornings that felt, even then, considerably simpler and considerably warmer than the grand social machinery that otherwise defined her family's public life. She has tried, deliberately, to build something similar for her own children, a single day each year carved out entirely from the performance, and watching Henry and Marian open gifts this past December with genuine unguarded delight, however briefly, before the machinery of the season resumed its usual demanding pace, remains, she thinks, one of the truer accomplishments of her entire married life. Quieter and less visible than any successful dinner party, and considerably more precious to her because of it. There is one more room worth visiting before we finally let this house rest. A library on the second floor, quieter and less remarked upon than the picture gallery or the ballroom, but genuinely one of Charles's favourite spaces in the entire house, more so, if he is honest, than almost any other room he could name. Shelves rise from floor to ceiling along 3 of the 4 walls, filled with books he has collected across the same 15 years he spent building his art collection, though with considerably less concern for their value as objects, and considerably more genuine, personal attachment to their content, history mostly, biographies of men who built things, the occasional novel Eleanor presses on him that he reads more slowly and with more resistance than he generally admits, though he usually finishes them, and usually, eventually admits she was right to insist. He comes here most evenings, after the household has largely settled, for an hour or so before joining Eleanor upstairs, a habit nearly as old as his Sunday morning walks, and serving, in its own quieter way, much the same private function. Tonight, with 30 guests to entertain, he has skipped this ritual entirely, and Eleanor notices, without either of them mentioning it directly, a particular restlessness in him during their late conversation in her dressing room, a small tell she has learnt to read across 20 years of marriage, the specific quality of tiredness that comes not simply from a long evening, but from an entire day spent without the one solitary hour he genuinely counts on to reset himself. She suggests, gently, that he take some time in the library before finally coming up, and he does, sitting alone for perhaps 20 minutes with a book he does not particularly focus on, simply grateful for the quiet, before finally climbing the stairs to join her. I think this small, unremarkable moment says something true about how even a marriage this comfortable, this genuinely warm after 2 decades together, still requires this kind of quiet, ongoing attention, a wife noticing her husband's particular exhaustion and making room for it, rather than simply expecting him upstairs on schedule, a small act of care so ordinary it would be easy to miss entirely inside a story this full of marble and gowns and elaborate dinner parties. But I think these are, in some ways, the moments that actually sustain a marriage across decades, considerably more than any grand gesture ever could. The accumulated weight of 1,000 small accommodations neither person particularly announces or expects thanks for. The library holds one shelf, tucked into a lower corner near the window, that belongs entirely to Marian and Henry. Children's books neither of them reads anymore, but that Eleanor has never allowed removed, worn copies with cracked spines, and in several cases, small pencil marks in a child's uncertain hand. Henry's early attempts at writing his own name inside the front cover of a book about ships that he loved, with a fierce, uncomplicated devotion, for the better part of a year, when he was 6. Eleanor dusts this shelf herself sometimes, rather than leaving it to the housemaids, a small private ritual she has never explained to anyone, running a hand along spines that carry, for her, an entire vanished era of her children's early lives, folded quietly into their worn covers. It occurs to me, thinking about this particular shelf, that every family, whatever its scale, whatever the marble or the lack of it surrounding their particular life, tends to keep some version of this exact thing, a small collection of ordinary objects that carry weight far beyond their actual value, precisely because they hold, folded inside them, a piece of time that cannot be recovered any other way. Eleanor's necklace, the tea service downstairs, this worn shelf of children's books nobody in the house has opened in years, and nobody, especially not Eleanor, would ever consider giving away. Let me give you one more season before we close, because we have spent most of tonight inside autumn and winter, and I think a proper picture of this family's year deserves at least a glimpse of spring, when the household begins its slow transition out of the heaviest part of the social calendar and toward the considerably more relaxed rhythm of the Newport summer still months away. Spring in this house means garden parties rather than formal dinners, entertainments held in the small private garden Eleanor loves so much, tables set out among the roses on the mildest afternoons, a lighter, more informal style of hosting that Eleanor genuinely prefers, if she is honest, to the heavier formality of the winter season, though she would never say so directly to anyone whose good opinion depends on believing she finds every occasion equally delightful. There is a particular garden party Eleanor remembers with real fondness from 2 springs ago, smaller than most of her entertainments, perhaps 20 guests rather than 30, held on an unusually warm afternoon in early May, when the roses had only just begun to open, and which she remembers less for any specific social accomplishment than for the simple, rare pleasure of an afternoon that felt, for a few hours, almost entirely unforced. Marian, 15 at the time, helped arrange the flowers herself, rather than leaving the task entirely to staff, an unusual indulgence Eleanor allowed specifically because she recognized, watching her daughter work, a genuine pleasure in the task rather than mere performance of one. Henry, home briefly between school terms, spent most of the afternoon entertaining a group of younger cousins with an easy, unguarded warmth that Eleanor treasures precisely because it appears so rarely once the more formal demands of his adult life begin properly asserting themselves. Ice, curiously enough, plays a considerably larger role in spring and summer entertaining than a modern listener might expect, and I think the specific mechanics of it are worth a few minutes because they illustrate something genuinely strange about the practical infrastructure required to maintain this kind of hospitality before mechanical refrigeration existed in any household form. The ice consumed by a household like the Whitfields across a single summer, chilling drinks, preserving food, occasionally even carved into elaborate decorative sculptures for the grandest entertainments, arrived through an entire seasonal industry built around harvesting actual ice from frozen lakes and rivers each winter, cut into enormous blocks, packed in sawdust for insulation, and stored in specially built ice houses through the warmer months. An entire supply chain that modern refrigeration eventually made almost entirely obsolete within a few decades, but which, in 1893, represented one of the quiet, unglamorous logistical foundations that made a hospitality this lavish and this consistent even possible. Eleanor thinks about spring tonight, lying here well past 2 in the morning after an evening built entirely around autumn's heavier formality, and finds herself genuinely looking forward to it, several months off still but already, in some quiet corner of her mind, beginning to take shape. The garden party she will host again this coming May, the particular pleasure of watching her roses open, the lighter, easier rhythm of a season that asks slightly less of her than the one she has just spent an entire long evening navigating. There is something worth noticing in that too, I think, the way even a life this thoroughly scheduled still contains its own internal seasons of relative ease and relative demand, its own quiet anticipation of gentler months ahead, not so different, in its basic shape, from the way anyone looks forward to a change of season, whatever their circumstances happen to be. Let me tell you finally how Eleanor and Charles actually met, because we have spent this entire evening inside their established marriage without ever properly visiting its beginning, and I think the story deserves its own quiet space before we close. It happened at a considerably smaller gathering than tonight's dinner, a musical evening hosted by a mutual acquaintance rather than any grand ball. Eleanor, 24 at the time, and beginning to feel, in the particular anxious way unmarried women of her circle felt it by that age, the quiet pressure of a season that had not yet produced the match her family had been patiently, carefully cultivating for several years already. Charles, 28, attended that same evening at the invitation of a business associate, still relatively new to this particular social circle. His fortune already considerable, but his social standing still very much in the earlier, more uncertain stages we discussed earlier tonight, before Eleanor's family name had lent him the additional legitimacy that would eventually come with marriage. Eleanor remembers noticing him almost immediately, not for any particular handsomeness, though he was, she still thinks, a genuinely fine-looking man even now, but for a specific quality of attention he brought to the room, listening far more than he spoke, watching the evening's dynamics with an alertness that reminded her, oddly, of the same careful social calculation she had spent her entire life being trained to perform herself, except that in him, still new to this particular world, it read as something closer to genuine curiosity than practiced skill. They spoke only briefly that first evening, a conversation of perhaps 10 minutes near the edge of the room, while the evening's music continued, and Eleanor remembers almost nothing specific of what either of them actually said, only the particular ease of it, a conversation that felt, unusually for her, entirely free of the careful calibration she brought to nearly every other social exchange in her life. Charles asked her, she recalls, an unusually direct question about a book she happened to be reading, rather than the more conventional pleasantries she generally expected from a young man at this stage of an introduction, and she remembers being surprised into an equally direct answer, the two of them falling, briefly, into something that felt less like the careful mutual assessment such conversations generally were, and more like an actual exchange between two people genuinely curious about each other's thoughts. The formal courtship that followed took the better part of a year, conducted through exactly the careful, engineered proximity we discussed earlier, dinners and calls and, eventually, the more explicit negotiations between their two fathers that concluded with a settlement both families found satisfactory. But underneath that formal architecture, Eleanor maintains, even now, 20 years later, that something genuine had already taken root during that first 10-minute conversation near the edge of a crowded room, a specific, particular liking that the more calculated machinery of courtship simply gave structure to, rather than manufactured from nothing. She has told this story to Marion once or twice, in the quiet, private register mother and daughter sometimes fall into that differs so completely from how this family speaks to anyone else, and has watched her daughter listen with a particular hopeful attention that Eleanor recognizes because she has felt the same hope herself, the wish that whatever careful, engineered proximity eventually produces Marion's own marriage, some genuine spark like that first conversation might be waiting somewhere inside it too. Charles remembers that same evening slightly differently, in the way husbands and wives often carry gently different versions of the same shared memory, insisting, whenever the story comes up, that he had decided within that first conversation, well before any formal courtship began, that he intended to marry her if the arrangement could possibly be managed, a claim Eleanor finds sweetly exaggerated but has never fully contradicted, because she rather likes the story he tells, and because 20 years of marriage have taught her that a small, flattering exaggeration, offered with genuine affection, does considerably less harm than a strict insistence on precise accuracy in matters that were never really about accuracy in the first place. There is one last small thread worth following before we finally let this house rest, and it concerns the gown itself, the one currently hanging back on its form in Eleanor's wardrobe. waiting for whatever comes next. Gowns at this level of construction were rarely worn more than a handful of times, considered, once photographed at a significant enough event or worn too often within the same social circle, no longer suitable for the front rank of entertaining, though they never simply vanished from the household the way that might suggest. Eleanor keeps a small, careful accounting of every significant gown she has owned across 20 years of marriage, not written down anywhere formal, simply held in memory, and she knows, without needing to check, that tonight's bronze silk will likely see 2 or perhaps 3 more wearings at gatherings slightly less prominent than tonight's dinner before it retires entirely from active rotation, eventually reworked, as many of her earlier gowns have been, into something else entirely, a simpler dress for at-home wear, or disassembled for its fabric and trim to be repurposed into something for Marion, a practice considerably more common among even the wealthiest households than a modern listener might expect, waste being, even here, even amid all this extraordinary abundance, something the era's practical instincts still quietly resisted. Eleanor has a small trunk in the attic, rarely opened, containing perhaps a dozen gowns from earlier years that she has never been able to bring herself to fully repurpose or give away, each one connected to some specific evening she still remembers with particular clarity: a summer ball the year before Henry was born, a New Year's gathering during a particularly difficult winter when Charles's business faced a brief, worrying downturn that never became public knowledge outside their own household, a dress worn to Marion's christening reception that Eleanor has kept, she suspects, largely because giving it up would feel like giving up some small physical piece of that particular, treasured day. She opens this trunk perhaps once a year, usually in early autumn when the household begins its own transition back toward the heavier social season, and spends a quiet half-hour simply looking through it, touching fabric that carries, for her, an entire private museum of her own married life folded into silk and lace that nobody else would recognize as significant at all. I think there is something worth sitting with in this small private ritual, tucked as it is into the corner of a life otherwise so thoroughly organized around visible public display. Underneath every gown Eleanor has ever worn to be seen, judged, admired, and quietly measured against other women's gowns at other dinners, there exists this considerably smaller, entirely private collection, kept not for anyone else's eyes but simply because each piece holds, for her alone, a fragment of time she is not yet ready to release. It is, in its own quiet way, exactly the same instinct that keeps the children's worn books on their library shelf, that keeps her mother-in-law's necklace in steady rotation instead of locked away as merely valuable, that sends a careful folded letter north to Catherine every single week without fail. The performance of this life is real and considerable and occupies nearly every daylight hour Eleanor has, but threaded quietly underneath it, in trunks and shelves and small folded letters, there persists this other Eleanor entirely, the one who keeps things not because they are valuable, but because they are hers. Let me tell you about the stable before we close, tucked behind the house near Eleanor's small garden, because it holds its own quiet corner of this family's life that we have not yet properly visited tonight. The household keeps 4 horses, 2 matched pairs, 1 set reserved for the formal carriage used for calls and evening entertaining, the other kept for more everyday use, riding and lighter errands, along with the carriages themselves, polished to the same exacting standard as everything else this family owns, and a small staff of grooms and a coachman who live above the stable in quarters considerably plainer than even the servants' rooms inside the main house itself, an entire separate small household existing quietly alongside the family's own. Henry has always loved this particular corner of the property more than almost any other, spending considerably more of his boyhood here than his more formal education would suggest, learning to ride almost before he learnt to properly read, developing an easy, genuine rapport with the coachman, a quiet man named Doyle, who has worked for the family for nearly 15 years and who taught Henry, patiently and without any of the careful social calculation that governs so much of the boy's life inside the main house, how to actually handle a horse, how to read its moods, how to earn its trust through steady, patient consistency rather than force. Henry credits Doyle, more than any tutor he has ever had, with teaching him the closest thing to genuine patience he currently possesses, a quality his father hopes, quietly, will eventually translate into the kind of careful business judgment that took Charles himself so many hard years to properly develop. Eleanor rides herself, less often now than in earlier years, but still occasionally, on quiet mornings when her schedule allows it, finding in it one of the few physical pleasures in her adult life that carries no social performance attached to it at all, nobody watching, nobody to impress, simply the specific rhythm of a horse moving beneath her through the park before the fashionable hour when everyone else she knows might be riding too, a small window of genuine solitary pleasure she guards as carefully as her garden, her trunk of old gowns, her folded letters north to Catherine. The horses themselves, worth mentioning briefly, represent their own small fortune, bred and trained specifically for exactly this kind of use. Carriage horses selected as much for their matched appearance, identical colouring and gait, as for any practical quality, because a mismatched pair pulling a family's carriage down Fifth Avenue would communicate, to anyone watching closely enough to notice, a small but real failure of the same careful attention to detail that governs every other visible aspect of this family's presentation to the world. Doyle maintains them with a devotion that borders on genuine love, and Eleanor has always found something quietly admirable in that too. A man whose entire professional life centers on the care of animals that exist, fundamentally, to be looked at and admired, and who nonetheless brings to that work a depth of genuine feeling that has nothing performed about it at all. One final small object deserves a mention before we finally close: the leather notebook we glimpsed briefly at the very start of tonight's story, the one sitting on Eleanor's writing desk with tomorrow's obligations already noted inside it. It is a plain thing, unremarkable beside the silver and marble surrounding it, purchased years ago from an ordinary stationer rather than commissioned from anywhere fashionable, and Eleanor has filled dozens of its predecessors across her married life, each one retired once full and replaced with an identical new copy, the completed notebooks themselves kept in a drawer nearby rather than discarded. An unbroken paper record of 20 years of exactly this kind of careful, continuous management, the invitations answered, the calls made and received, the small accumulated architecture of an entire life built one scheduled hour at a time. She rarely looks back through the old ones, but she keeps them anyway, and I think that small habit says something true about the whole evening we have spent together tonight. This entire enormous, glittering, carefully constructed world resting, in the end, on something as plain and ordinary as a woman's handwriting in a leather notebook, noting down tomorrow's obligations before finally allowing herself to sleep. Tomorrow's page holds only 3 items, comparatively light after tonight's exertions: a morning call to return, a note to Marian's tutor about a schedule change, and a reminder, written in Eleanor's own careful hand, to answer Catherine's next letter promptly, whenever it happens to arrive. There is a final small sound worth mentioning before the house falls fully silent, one Eleanor has come to associate, across 2 decades, entirely with the safe, successful end of an evening like tonight's. It is the sound of the front door closing after the very last guest departs, a specific weight to it, solid brass and heavy oak settling into its frame, with a low, satisfied thud that Eleanor can distinguish, even now, from every other door in the house, and which she has always privately thought of as the true final note of any dinner party, considerably more honest than any compliment offered at the threshold, a simple mechanical confirmation that the evening, whatever its small tensions and quiet triumphs, has ended, and ended well enough that nothing remains now but rest. Whitmore closes it the same way every single time, a habit so deeply worn into him after 9 years, that Eleanor suspects he could do it in his sleep, and in some sense tonight he very nearly will, retiring himself only a short while after the last of his duties are finished, to a room on the household's upper floors considerably plainer than anything we have spent this evening admiring, where he will sleep soundly enough despite the late hour, secure in the particular satisfaction of a difficult evening executed without a single visible flaw. Marian, before finally falling asleep herself tonight, takes out one of her small watercolours from its hiding place, not to work on it, simply to look at it for a moment in the low light of her single bedside lamp, a study of the garden fountain her mother loves so much, painted from memory rather than from life, the proportions slightly wrong in a way that would embarrass her if anyone else ever saw it, though she finds, looking at it now, that the small imperfection barely bothers her tonight. She thinks briefly of the two young men seated near her at dinner, of January and the debut still waiting ahead of her, of the particular poise she managed to hold across an entire long evening without once feeling, from the inside, quite as composed as she apparently appeared. She puts the painting away, extinguishes the lamp, and sleeps. Henry falls asleep almost the moment his head meets the pillow, the easy, dreamless sleep of a young man who has not yet been asked to carry very much, though somewhere in the back of his mind, even tonight, a small persistent thought about his father's business, about when exactly he will finally be trusted with something real rather than merely decorative, follows him partway into sleep before finally releasing its hold entirely. Delacroix, walking home through the cold well after midnight, already turning over in his mind a small improvement he intends to make to a sauce he considers not quite perfect yet, thinks briefly, as he sometimes does on nights like this one, of a small kitchen in Paris he trained in as a young man, considerably plainer than the one he now commands, and feels, despite the late hour and the ache in his feet, a genuine satisfaction in how far his craft has carried him, an entire ocean and a lifetime away from where he began. Even Augusta, riding home in her own carriage a little after midnight, finds herself thinking of Eleanor more warmly than she expected to when the evening began, the small thaw at the doorway settling into something she suspects, with a mixture of relief and mild surprise, might genuinely last this time, past the coming weeks, past the next inevitable small friction that this world will eventually produce between them again. Rivalries in this circle rarely resolve themselves entirely. She has learned across many years of practicing exactly this particular art, but they could soften season by season into something closer to a wary, enduring fondness, and she thinks, watching the lamplit houses pass by her carriage window, that this might finally be one of those. Sarah, 3 floors above the family she serves, sleeps deeply and without dreams she will remember, her body simply grateful for rest after a long day of carrying trays through narrow hidden passages, and somewhere in the back of her tired mind, before sleep fully takes her, a small quiet thought about the letter she will write home this coming Sunday, the one small ordinary thing in her own week that belongs entirely, privately to her. And Charles, before finally drifting off beside his wife, thinks briefly of the hospital ward he never mentions, of the small quiet good it does somewhere across the city tonight, while 30 guests slept off 9 courses of the very best this fortune could buy, and finds, in that thought, a particular kind of peace that no amount of marble in this house has ever quite managed to give him on its own. Doyle, above the stable, checks on the 4 horses one last time before turning in himself, running a familiar hand along the nearest mare's neck in the dark, murmuring something quiet and wordless the animal has long since learned to recognize as simple, ordinary affection, and then climbs the narrow stairs to his own small room, where he sleeps, as he has for 15 years now, considerably closer to the horses he loves than to the family whose name is on the deed. The gardener, though he has long since gone home for the night to a small house several streets over, will be back before dawn regardless, as he always is, to check the roses along the wall before the frost season truly settles in, a quiet devotion to a garden that is not his own, but that he has tended for so many years now, it feels, in every way that matters to him, entirely his all the same. And somewhere further down the avenue, in houses very much like this one, other households are settling into this exact same hour in their own particular way. Other Elaners and other Charleses and other Sarahs, the entire small, glittering, exhausted world of this particular street finally, gradually, quietly going still. Let us close the evening properly now. It is nearly 2 in the morning. The house is fully still, the kind of stillness that only settles into a building this large very late at night, once every guest has gone and every task has finally been finished, and there is, for a few hours at least, genuinely nothing left for anyone to do but sleep. Eleanor is asleep, her breathing slow and even, the necklace that belonged to Charles's mother back in its case on the dressing table, the gown that took Madame Rousseau's staff the better part of a week to construct hanging once more on its form in the wardrobe, waiting for its next occasion. Charles sleeps in the room beside hers, the door between them left slightly open, the way it has been every night of their marriage, a small habit neither of them has ever needed to discuss. Marian sleeps 2 floors up, in a room that still, in its corners, holds faint traces of the child she was, a shelf of books she has long since outgrown but never asked to have removed, and somewhere among her private things, a small stack of watercolors nobody else in the house has ever seen. Henry sleeps down the hall from her, in the easy, dreamless way of a 19-year-old who has not yet been asked to carry very much real weight, though the weight is coming, gently, gradually, the way it comes for everyone eventually. 3 floors above all of them, in rooms considerably plainer and considerably smaller. Sarah sleeps too, for now, though her night will end well before anyone else's, the household's actual first waking a full hour before Eleanor so much as stirs. Whitmore has made his last round. Mrs. Pruitt has checked that every fire below stairs is properly banked for the night. Delacroix, the chef, left hours ago for his own small apartment several streets over, already turning over tomorrow's menu in his mind the way he does most nights, unable to entirely switch that particular part of himself off even in sleep. The tea service sits on the sideboard downstairs, silent and waiting. 3 generations of a family's mornings folded quietly into its silver, ready to be filled again in a few hours and carried once more to the same table it has served for longer than anyone currently sleeping in this house has been alive. Outside, Fifth Avenue has gone as quiet as a city street this size ever truly gets, the gas lamps burning low and steady, the occasional distant sound of the harbour drifting up faintly from the water, ships arriving and departing at all hours regardless of what the fashionable world above them happens to be doing. Somewhere out there, a great many other lives are unfolding in this exact same hour, lives that would look nothing at all like the one we have spent tonight inside. Families in tenement rooms a few miles south, families on farms considerably further out, an entire enormous varied country going about its own version of this exact same ordinary night. Eleanor's house is only one house among all of them, extraordinary in its particulars, oddly ordinary underneath, a family loving each other imperfectly and privately and as well as they know how, inside a structure that gave them nearly everything and still, somehow, left each of them holding some small quiet thing back for themselves alone. I think that is where I want to leave you tonight, in that thought, rather than in any tidy summary of what it all meant. A house full of marble and gold leaf and 9-course dinners, and underneath every bit of it, simply people, worrying about their children, missing their mothers, writing careful letters to sisters they love, keeping small private hopes tucked into drawers nobody else ever opens. The gilding was real, so was everything underneath it. Both things were always true at once, the entire evening through, and I suspect that is closer to the actual truth of most lives, however grand or however plain the house happens to be that holds them. The lamps on the street are burning low now. The house has gone fully quiet. Some were upstairs, in a room with pale blue silk on the walls. A woman who spent her whole day performing for other people is finally, simply, resting. No audience left to please, nobody left to convince of anything at all. That seems like the right note to leave things on. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. We have spent an evening somewhere real, or at least somewhere real enough, and now it is time to let it, and you, finally rest.